Hey everyone, Anark here, and this is another Anark Livestream. I messed up my mic a little bit there at the beginning, but everything should be good now. So welcome everybody who's already showing up. I'm going to put this link in all the places, you know, what I usually do. So let's get started. How's everybody doing today? For those of you who have already showed up. There we go. Nice. What is these little crowns? Is it showing us community leaderboard? Oh, okay. Oh, it's telling me who's been talking the most? I have no idea what this is. There's a new feature here. So first question we're seeing today is from the Cardinal, and they say, hey, I'm still a baby anarchist. Can you tell me something about Chaz? I've seen some anarchists say it actually wasn't anarchist. It was just an occupation. Can you tell me about that? So I guess that's up for debate, whether it was or was not anarchist. I would say that it was not very well organized. And that makes sense. I don't think anybody who's really involved in that whole thing was really expecting that to happen. They were just clashing with the police, as protesters often do. And they just so happened to have succeeded in pushing the police out of that area. However, what we see afterwards is just that a bunch of people came together in order to create an occupation, as you say, and that it kind of ended up being a mutual aid fair is kind of what it turned into. You had a bunch of people, all from different groups, all from different factions, coming together and providing things to people, and there was live music and so on. It did not have any form of democratic structure. It really wasn't formally organized at all. Everything was very informally organized. So it wasn't like explicitly anarchist. However, I would say that it's kind of in line with some individualist anarchist praxis, specifically like temporary autonomous zones. So it was kind of a TAZ, as they sometimes call it. If you hear about temporary autonomous zones afterwards, well, that is pretty well an example of one of those temporary autonomous zones. I don't know if it's necessarily the best example. It didn't turn out so hot in many ways, but that is pretty much what a temporary autonomous zone is. And it fulfilled that purpose more generally, I suppose. I think that its main problem, the thing that they did wrong, is that there was no formal organization. That should have been absolutely the very first thing that was done as soon as the Chaz was established. They should have created a democratic body using consensus and delegation where everybody who was involved with the zone would come to these meetings, maybe not every single day, but maybe like once a week or, you know, maybe once every few days. That is what they should have done. It would have turned out a lot better, I can assure you. People are saying Murray's in the background. Yeah, he's eating food. Murray's so cute. He's getting more calm as he gets older, which is welcome. It's a welcome change, but no guarantees that he's not going to chew on me during the live stream. He's already been doing little chirps once he heard me talking at the screen. I think he gets annoyed when I talk at the screen. He's like, "Who the fuck are you talking to right now? This is very confusing, human. Why are you talking at your computer?" But yeah, I think he gets used to it more and more as I do the channel longer while I have him. The Murray Goblin era is ending. Yeah, it really is. He's getting more calm. Oh yeah, usually at the beginning of a live stream, I'll do like channel update stuff. So as you might have seen, I'm not releasing a whole lot of videos. That's because I'm focusing a lot on A Modern Anarchism Part 4. And I only have about 30 minutes of visuals left. And it'll probably end up actually being a little bit less than that just because of cuts to the audio and so on. So Part 4 of A Modern Anarchism is closer than it's ever been. Know that there is work being done on it every single day. And I know it's taken forever. I think we're coming up on like the 2-year mark or maybe even more. But it will be done. And after that, hopefully my release schedule on the video essays will get shorter. You know, it occurs to me that there are a ton of people who watch this channel who subscribed after after the last video essay. And that was like several years ago now. So a lot of people don't know that that's what this channel used to be, was a video essay channel. But because the video essays began taking longer and longer and requiring more and more work, I began to do shorter off-the-cuff videos in order to sort of keep the channel going. But my passion is still the video essays. So you can still expect those to be released. If you're here for the video essays, don't worry. They are still being produced and there will be more to come. I'm already writing scripts for 3 more video essays. So don't you worry about that. Financially, the channel is stagnating, and I don't think I'm the only channel that's happening to. I'm hearing lots of YouTubers, lots of content creators saying that their subscribers are not building as fast, that they are not making as much money as content creators, and that is actually what I am facing as well. For the last 2 months, my earnings have pretty well stagnated, which is pretty nerve-wracking as a creator, actually. So if y'all want to support the channel and you do have money to spare, just know this is kind of a crucial time to support the channel. I definitely need some kind of bounce back on the patrons. So I'll link the Patreon for anybody who wants to become a donor. Any amount that you can spare is very appreciated, and I appreciate everybody who's already a patron. You're the reason why I can spend so much time working on this channel, so much time working on massive 3-hour video essays. And also I'll just remind people that every month that my patrons go up, I donate a percentage of my Patreon money to Cooperation Tulsa, which is the organization that I'm involved in. So when you donate to my Patreon, you're actually also donating a percentage of your Patreon to Cooperation Tulsa. So a percentage of that is going to Cooperation Tulsa. So just know that it is very much worth your money. If you support the work that I'm doing on this channel, then please become a patron. Anyway, somebody donated $5. Professor Yaoi. I don't actually know how it's pronounced. I've seen that word 1,000 times. But it says, thoughts on mental health support / community healthcare as a revolutionary act. I think it's absolutely something that we need on the left. We unfortunately have a problem on the left where people who are not in a good mental space, who are maybe even having a mental health crisis, will be in leftist spaces, and they deserve care. They need care. They need somebody to help them. They need somebody to give them, feedback and assistance and stability, and they're looking for a community. But sometimes as well, people can be very volatile when they're in those mental health crises, and that can be damaging to our organizations, to our spaces. Not that it's their fault necessarily, but, leftist organizational spaces are not equipped to deal with mental health crises and are not equipped to be therapeutic services to people who are, having mental health crises. So that sort of thing is incredibly, incredibly important and valuable, because then we are prefiguring alternative, mental health services, and community healthcare more broadly would be excellent. That one is I would say, even harder to get started. Or rather, it's easy to do on a miniature scale, but it's hard to do at the scale that would be needed, right? Like, it wouldn't be too hard to give people Narcan or to help them with their prescription meds or whatever, but it would be very challenging to give them cancer treatment from a prefigurative standpoint. It's not impossible, but we'd have to build from the ground up. And so we absolutely do need a prefigurative healthcare. Prefigurative healthcare could be enormous if we could get it working. But I actually, because I don't really work in the industry and I'm not really familiar with all the ins and outs, I couldn't really even tell you how to get started. But I will say that it is incredibly valuable. Both of those things would be incredibly valuable to the movement. Okay, wow. So I've missed a bunch of stuff in the meantime. Let's see here. Kristen Supine says, question, I imagine economic immiseration is going to worsen tenfold in the U.S. Should we still focus on the revolutionary process, or should this be a period of simple aid and survival, or both? Well, I mean, I actually think that is going to lead to more immiseration, and more immiseration often leads to more revolutionary foment. So it seems quite possible that actually that will lead to more revolutionary foment, and people needing help, simple aid and survival, as you said, is an opportunity for revolutionary organizations to demonstrate the reality of their claims that they really are here to help people. And so it is actually an opportunity for prefiguration, creating the alternative institutions. And in that sense, it actually is very high potential for revolutionary activity. So I would say, no, we should absolutely not be abandoning revolutionary activity just for harm reduction. Harm reduction should be part of a revolutionary process. Anarchopill says, thoughts on the events that led up to the First International splitting? Was Ingalls just malding when you wrote On Authority? I mean, yeah, he was. The First International was disgraceful by Marx and Engels. Their behavior in the First International was some of our first examples of like a vanguard trying to coup or trying to co-opt an organic movement that came from the bottom up. And so what we see there is, I suppose, probably what a lot of the vanguardists think is acceptable behavior, and it was treacherous. I mean, the Marx and Engels essentially convened a secret council that declared itself as the governing council of the entire First International, even though the First International was previously based on essentially horizontal direct democracy and delegation. Instead, what we saw with this sort of like illegal, you might say, or out of the rules governing council that Marx and Engels created was that it was essentially just a body to wrest control over the First International. And then when most of the factions of the First International got upset about it and said that it was essentially an authoritarian power grab, Engels wrote On Authority in response. So, yeah, it was essentially him malding about the fact that the revolutionaries of the First International did not approve of Marx and Engels trying to co-opt the First International. Disgraceful stuff, to be honest. Rebel Kaito, as people have said in chat, it seems like you might just misunderstand what the anarchist vision for society is. You seem to think that government is organization. That's not what we mean by government. By government, we are talking, and this is other people's use in anarchist texts. Government is a centralized, or you could say hierarchical apparatus of control. It is not a body by which administration takes place. Every single society would then, therefore, have a government or state. Anarchists are not advocating for lawlessness, or rather, I should say, they're not advocating for there to be no rules and everybody can just do as they please. They are instead advocating for a society of horizontal management, where everybody is essentially part of the process of determining how everything works in society, that all power flows from the bottom and is then delegated to people who will carry out administrative tasks. So a system by which there is sortition into horizontal council structures is not at all what anarchists are objecting to. Mad Boy nails it. Anarchism is when there are no rulers, not when there are no rules. Bonezar says, have you heard about the union busting happening at TCG Player? Yeah, I mean, I know about it because I saw a video by Maldhound where he was talking about it. And yeah, I mean, that's not good. I'm disappointed in the website. I'm disappointed in TCG Player for not just allowing the union to be created. But I suppose that's what you should expect from any hierarchical power structure once they get big enough. Disappointing. I think that probably the only solution is for the unions to become more militant. I'm not entirely sure to what degree that, public awareness is going to matter, because it's kind of just within the niche of Magic players. It's possible that a coordinated boycott of TCG Player could be effective, especially if the union that they tried to bust is involved. And especially if that campaign were to, essentially be able to communicate its demands to TCG Player and to coordinate with the community to boycott TCG Player. But I've already heard people saying organically they intend to boycott TCG Player. So it's possible that this could turn into something more sophisticated, but I would like to see it turn into something sophisticated in order for there to be pressure on TCG Player. BTF says, how's life in Oklahoma? Are people as reactionary there as its reputation? Some people are. Yeah, absolutely. But not everyone. I think that when people come to Tulsa, they are always sort of shocked to see how strong the counterculture in Tulsa is. They always kind of expect it to be just like, a bunch of like conservative rednecks, and that's not what they find when they come here. In Tulsa, we definitely have some conservatives. We have virulent fascists of certain types, but we also have a really strong underground. We have a strong counterculture in the music scene, and we have a we have a flourishing organizing scene, you might say. Pretty much ever since I've gotten involved in organizing, there's been various organizations in Tulsa. And so, it's not quite as bad. We also have a flourishing queer community, and we have for decades now. This is this is where the Greenwood Massacre took place, and the black people that were the sons and daughters of the victims of the Greenwood Massacre, most of them didn't flee, or many of them didn't flee, and so the grandchildren of those people are still here, and that has a radicalizing effect. It's also where a bunch of the tribes with sovereignty have overlapping territories. So it's actually a very radical state in many ways that people are not familiar with. Margot Sorn says, thoughts on Hassan Piker and Sam Cedar? What's your go-to source for news? Yeah, I watch a bunch of SOCDEM news aggregators. I'll watch Kyle Kulinski, Hassan Piker, Sam Cedar. Hassan, at this point, I think that most people should recognize that Hassan must be doing something pretty subversive, given that he's being like detained by customs when he tries to come into the United States and is interrogated for his positions on Palestine. Say what you will of Hassan's politics. Hassan clearly is doing something that is subversive to the United States, as they clearly see him as a threat. I think he's a pretty good news aggregator. I don't necessarily, as I've said numerous times, don't necessarily agree with his politics completely, but I agree with a lot of what he says, his takes on a lot of the issues that he's discussing in the news. Sam Cedar, Majority Reports, it's all right. I think I like it, Kyle Kulinski a little bit better as a news aggregator. But yeah, those, I watch a lot of those, and used to be I got a lot of news from Twitter. These days, Twitter is almost useless, but yeah. Mm-hmm. Kyle Kulinski, look for Secular Talk. Pretty sure that's what it's called. Secular Talk. Kyle Kulinski, Kulinsky, I believe. Perky Prophet says, I'm skeptic of Hassan. I live with a longtime fanboy and I've not seen much further political interest from them. Seems like a cult of personality a bit. Yeah, I mean, that's fair. That's, I don't think Hassan is really pipelining people necessarily into more radical action. He's a news aggregator. But that's just, I think that's what he is. He's a news aggregator. Opinion on Blue Sky. I expected it to blow up bigger as Twitter fell apart, but weirdly, it doesn't seem like it's blowing up much bigger. Seems like it's slowly perhaps becoming kind of a dead platform, but that's just my interaction with it. It doesn't seem like it's becoming the Twitter alternative, but I guess we'll see what happens. Right now, it seems like it's mostly like a hug box for liberals. Ned says, do you believe a Jeffersonian, decentralist, progressive, anti-federalist, anti-executive party that focuses on making state governments horizontal would be a good start towards positive American anarchy? No, it wouldn't. Because functioning within the state means that you're always going to be serving the state. That's pretty much just how it works. I don't know of any counterexamples. It's pretty much never had a success. That's never been successful. Furthermore, that's not going to happen. They're not actually going to change the structure of the government to make it decentralist or progressive, certainly not anti-federalist. The groups that are currently involved, which is to say the Democratic Party, that are ostensibly progressive, are very federalist, or rather very central government, very executive focused. They're very much just the party of the liberal republic. And then you have the Republicans, which are, of course, about hyper authoritarianism, the highest concentration of executive power, along with the highest concentration of corporate power conceivable. And I don't really believe that third parties have any feasibility in the United States. But possibly if the Democrats fell apart, then we could see a third party begin to take hold in the vacuum that they leave behind. But insofar as the Democrats maintain their stranglehold over being the second party, then we will not probably ever see a third party, in my opinion. Rebel Kaito, it seems like you might have very deeply misunderstood what libertarian leftist entails. It seems like in your mind, the state is just organization. It seems to me like you're imagining that the state is any time people get together and make decisions about how to administrate society. And if that's the case, then I don't know. I mean, it doesn't sound like anarcho-communism is actually what you want. Anarcho-communism isn't just like this utopian vision of a future society where everybody just so happens to do as thou wilt, and then what they wilt is communism. It's a society where we organize actively to create communist property relations and to create a communist economy of direct distribution. And that will absolutely entail that there will be administrative bodies by which people make decisions together. It's essentially democracy on steroids. It's democracy from the bottom up, direct democracy, not a republic. So I don't know what you think anarcho-communism is, but it is not. There is no anarcho-communism that is founded on a complete lack of organization and a complete lack of rulemaking by the people. The state is not just administration. The state is a particular body wherein power is concentrated in the hands of just a few people, and they make decisions for all of society, as opposed to what is being proposed here, which is the abolition of the state. That is to say, the distribution of all decision-making power to the people made horizontally. So you definitionally cannot have a horizontal state. That's not possible. For something to be horizontal is for it to be the negation of the state. The state is based in centralization and hierarchy. Some people here are mentioning Rojava. Is Rojava socialist? I mean, there are like aspects of it where you could say that it's based in, I would say like the ideology, the founding ideologies of Rojava are libertarian socialist. Has it actually created worker control? No. It has a growing percentage of its economy, which are worker cooperatives, and all of the businesses are socialized into the councils. But we are seeing an increasing centralization within Rojava, which, if it is not currently a state, is becoming a state. But the future is very uncertain for Rojava, so it's hard to say what's going to happen here in the next few years. Rebel Kaito, you should watch my video after the revolution. Edgar Estrada says the state does not equal governance. Yeah, this is like a very common way of describing the difference here. And it's a way I've used to describe it before as well. And that is that governance is basically just civil administration of society, right? Whereas the state is a particular form of governance, a hierarchical power structure. So I think that a lot of people describe it that way. You will, of course, find anarchists who will also, essentially make the state and government, indistinguishable or very much like equal to one another, like they just mean the same thing for a lot of anarchists. So if you see an anarchist saying that they are against the government, most of the time they mean they're against the state. Malatesta makes at least an interesting distinction here. The government is the body of people, whereas the state is the social apparatus. But I personally don't make that same distinction. I think that, it makes sense, like in our common colloquial language, to say that what libertarian socialists advocate is horizontal governance. And you'll actually find that kind of language, for example, in the Zapatistas, where somebody else said earlier, the people decide and the government obeys. And here by government, they just mean the people that carry out those administrative tasks. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, delegates are, quote unquote, the government by this conception. But you could also just say that all of the horizontal structures are the government. I think this is just, mostly a terminological thing. For my own part, I think it's easier to tell people that anarchists are for horizontal governance, but other anarchists will bristle at that characterization. Yeah, self-governance, as somebody, or as Knowledge and Defense says in chat. Simnot Sam says, Daniel, what's your opinion of Matt Dillahunty? I've actually always liked Matt Dillahunty. I've been an atheist for many years now, and I've always thought that he's been one of the most reasonable, level-headed guys. Every once in a while I've seen him be kind of, insulting, but most of the time it was to prove a point that he was correct about. And I've been pleased to see that Matt is one of the atheists, or one of the skeptics from that era of new atheism that did not become a right-wing chud. Quite the opposite. It seems like he became very progressive. And that's how I would characterize from what I've seen, is that he's a progressive. But I don't know if I've seen him say anything which was characteristically leftist. Don't know if he's like a socialist or anything, but he definitely has become a progressive. He seems like a social democrat, and that's very refreshing. I wish more of the new atheists had become social democrats. Anarcho Pill says, thoughts on Jordan Peterson versus 20 Christians? Some of the clips of that were hilarious. Yeah, I mean, brutal. Jordan Peterson just got absolutely wrecked. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was actually kind of pathetic. He should have fared better. The reason he didn't fare better is because his entire position has been a house of cards for a long time now. Jordan Peterson likes to call himself Christian when it's convenient, and then he likes to distance himself from Christianity when it's not convenient to be Christian. So, Jordan Peterson, I'm just going to try to accurately characterize Jordan Peterson's position. Jordan Peterson doesn't believe in God and does not believe that Jesus transcended to heaven. I don't even think he believes in the supernatural as far as I can see. Jordan Peterson thinks that Christianity is metaphorically true at a level that is ontological. He thinks that it's ontologically true, but not in the sense that it has been said in the Bible. It's like if you were to metaphorize Christianity and you were to look at the themes of, sin and forgiveness and self-sacrifice and all of that, and you were to take those metaphors, he believes those metaphors are ontologically true of the universe, which is fine. We can have that discussion, I'm open to that discussion, but he won't say it like that. Because if he said it like that, he would be able to be attacked on the basis of that position, right? Then a person could easily say, well, you don't believe it's actually true. So now we have to discuss how the metaphors are true in practice. And to what degree are those metaphors especially unique to Christianity in such a way that we can't find them elsewhere, or that we couldn't find them outside of Christianity without all of the metaphysical baggage? He doesn't want to engage with that, because if he engaged with that, he would have to engage with the history of philosophical critique of Christianity. So what he wants to do instead is he wants to argue for the values of Christianity without claiming himself as a Christian, which, once again, that's all well and good. He's not the only person who has done that. He's just more deceptive than most people who have done that in the history of philosophy. There's a whole sect of quote unquote Christians that you could call atheist Christians that are basically in line with what I just said about Jordan Peterson. The difference is that they don't pretend like Jordan Peterson does that they are Christian in the same sense as someone who believes in Christ and God in a literal sense, that all of that literally happened. The Bible is true. So Jordan Peterson is being deceptive. He's being deceptive. He's constantly, it's a Mott and Bailey is what it is. He wants you to fight with the idea of this sort of obscure metaphorizing of the universe instead of having to actually engage the fact he's not truly in the sense that we might say a Christian. He doesn't believe in Christ. He doesn't believe in the literalness of the Bible. But if he said that, then he could rightly, I would say, be decried as one of these, woke liberal professors, right? I mean, like, imagine how a Christian must look at an atheistic Christian. They're going to say they're not a true Christian. They're going to say this person doesn't represent us. He would be shunned if he were vocal in that sense. And in fact, I know some people who literally were going to school for theology and they ended up down that path where they were kind of these atheistic Christians, and their professors who were atheistic Christians were shunned out of school in that sense. They essentially weren't allowed. They were allowed to operate there, but nobody was happy about it. And they were marginalized within that community and weren't seen as like true Christians. So you can imagine Jordan Peterson would have to face that same backlash if he were to be honest about his position. So he's not. So what happens instead? He's essentially constantly lying about his positions. Okay, well, that works out well when you have sort of untrained rhetoricians, when you have people that can't really engage with that weird obscurity that I just mentioned, like all that kind of like, he's kind of this and kind of that. He's saying this thing, but what he means is that, right? Like all of that, I'm only able to pick that out. And I've only been able to pick that out from like several years ago, because I'm listening to what he's saying and it sounds so familiar to that, right? I can kind of get where he's going with these rhetorical choices. So it works well on people that are just confused by what the fuck he's saying. And you'll notice he flourishes on confusing his opponent. That's essentially Jordan Peterson's main rhetorical style. He wants to confuse the opponent. He wants to make them think about things. He wants to make them confused about what the hell he's saying so that they can't engage directly with what he's saying. And every time they try to characterize him, he goes, well, that's not what I'm saying. And they go, okay, well, I'll try to characterize you again. Well, that's not what I'm saying either, bucko. Like this is his whole thing, is like he's trying to dupe the opponent into straw manning him because he can't say what he actually believes, or he would be basically shunned from the Christian community, and conservatives probably would not be nearly as tolerant of him. So here's the thing, though. He goes on this program, he goes on Jubilee, and he's going to 1v20 a bunch of atheists. But the whole thing is the atheists are there to debate him as a Christian, like not as a metaphorical atheistic Christian, but as an actual Christian. Like clearly that's what they were all invited there to do, was to debate Christianity as atheists. And they show up and they, of course, find, as I just said, that he's not like literally, he's kind of like metaphorically a Christian, right? And so they're in this situation where they're not allowing him to wriggle out from their questions, right? There was two specific ones that got clip farmed a whole bunch where these guys were just pushing and pushing and pushing because they were like, no, I'm not going to let you wiggle the fuck out. That's just not going to happen. Answer my questions. I'm going to engage with what you're saying and I'm going to pick it apart. It's time for you to be put under scrutiny. You wanted to 1v20 some atheists, so let's go. And he crumbled. He absolutely had no response to a skeptical inquiry. He had no response to people who just did not buy into his bullshit. He crumbled completely. And that's where all of these clips are coming from, is because he does not have a response to somebody who just cuts through the bullshit. And if you cut through the bullshit too fast, if you take too sharp a knife, he's like, wow, oh, this isn't in good faith. It's like, no, it's in exceptionally good faith. I'm cutting through your deception. I see what you're saying. And now we're going to get to the point. He didn't like that. And so he characterized them getting to the point as bad faith. because he thinks good faith would be playing the ring around the rosy that he likes to play. He wants to lead them around in fucking circles and in weird, stupid, confusing rhetorical tricks. And he thinks that's what good faith looks like. Follow me around into my silly rhetorical tricks. Play around in this land of make-believe that I'm living in. And if somebody doesn't play around in his land of make-believe, he'll characterize them as bad faith and trying to do a gotcha. And the problem is he can't defend his position upon its own merits. He can only hopefully confuse the other party long enough that they cannot properly critique his position. So that's what happened. He finally faced somebody who was just going to tear that shit apart, who's just going to take a scalpel and take it apart and show everybody all the pieces and say, hey, look how full of shit this guy is. And he did not like that. Did not like that. I think I saw somebody up above say something about, for all his talk about postmodernism, Jordan Peterson sure is a postmodernist. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, a lot of people have been noting this lately, is that the right has proceeded into this era of post-truth and pure subjectivism. Like, if I believe it, it's true kind of thing, that there is no big T truth. There's just a bunch of little T truths. And why can't you listen to me? Why can't you entertain my absurd belief? I don't think they've consciously weaponized it. I think that it was just open to being weaponized that way. I think that, once there are no standards for deriving truth, then of course any position can be argued as having equal validity. And I know people like to claim that's not true, but it just is true. The postmodernists themselves can deny it all they like, but it's the conclusion of their work. And so the right wing was bound to co-opt postmodernism, it's just obvious for them. Fascism doesn't care about the truth. In fact, it operates in opposition to the truth. And therefore, postmodernist rhetorical tools were always going to be very helpful for the fascists. And I'm not at all shocked that they've utilized these sorts of, post-truth rhetorical tools that we've seen were previously very popular on the left. Petition to get Anark on Jubilee. They would never put me on there. I'm not famous enough. They only seem to put people on there who are big personalities of some sort or another. I would do it though. I'd be totally down. Because you know what? I've been in rooms where I'm 1v20ing liberals or 1v20ing conservatives, where there aren't nearly as many rules, where they're all just talking over each other and shouting and so on. So I think I could probably do well in that environment with a little bit of structure. Thurna says, is the scientific method applied to politics a viable path for discerning truth? I will say that I think the scientific method is valuable no matter what you're doing. I think that we should always take into consideration good scientific thinking. But I do want to say that as science is applied to increasingly social phenomena, it becomes increasingly difficult to apply it scrupulously. And a big part of that is that when you are looking at more and more physical, which is to say less and less social phenomena, I'm not saying that social is not physical. I'm just getting at, non-psychological phenomena, is you're getting more and more towards particles and physical things. And that is easier to use the scientific methodology on because there are no games being played, right? Everything is precisely what it appears. As you measure it, you get measurements and so on and so on. Even in quantum mechanics, we can see the scientific method continues to be highly valuable in deriving knowledge. However, when you get into psychology and sociology and politics, what you see is that things get increasingly difficult to disentangle their roots. Where did this start? Linearity becomes very, very challenging. It's hard to find an A, then B, then C sort of situation taking place. Instead, everything is deeply entangled, deeply intertwined. And might I add, people act in ways that have nothing to do with what you might consider their basic material interests. So much of the time, people are acting in highly ideological ways. People can be brainwashed. Entire populations can be deluded and made to believe false things. It becomes very difficult to apply the scientific method to such a chaotic system. And this is something that, of course, science studies in the field of chaos theory. Chaos theory is essentially the study of our inability to understand the evolution of systems, if the system has particular characteristics. And human society and human psychology these are very chaotic systems. So the scientific method is not probably going to be able to take us all the way to the finish line when it comes to deriving truths in psychology, sociology, and politics. Instead, we are stuck trying to derive things from first principles and then test those models derived from first principles in the real world, both as practice and observationally. And so this is not an invalid way to do science, but it is certainly much less rigorous than the hard sciences. Not because there is any weakness, not because it's not due to the lack of brilliance of the scientists who are sociologists, political theorists, etc. Not at all. In fact, very deeply brilliant and insightful people. It's that the thing that they are studying and trying to model is just so much more complex, so much more chaotic, so much more mediated by delusions, misconceptions, etc. And so hopefully that makes sense as an answer. It's just very difficult to apply the scientific method to metascale things. And that's why, for example, I don't call my theory science. I think it's very inspired by science as much as I can. I'm taking the discoveries of science and I'm applying them to political theory, but I don't think that any political theory has ever risen to the level of a science up to this date. Knowledge and Defense says, wait, I thought you didn't like debating. No, actually, I love debating. I'm a huge fan of debate, actually, but I also have enough humility to recognize that debate is a very limited tool and that it's only really successful in certain circumstances. Those circumstances have to be ones where you have a sufficient audience where their minds might be swayed one way or the other, where you have a debate partner that is in good faith. That's one of the things I might doubt about the Jubilee one, is that I think that I would probably have a number of bad faith opponents. And yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think it's a lot about context. So like, I debated one time and I debated socialism done left, both because I thought they would be good faith interlocutors, and that I understood their position and that their audience was probably rational enough to hear my argument. But for example, I would never go on a fascist's podcast and argue with them because they are not going to be good faith and their audience isn't open to being convinced otherwise anyway. A lot of the time why I'm not going to debate with authoritarian leftists is because I've engaged so much with their style of argumentation that I know it is based in deception and gotchas and mistellings of history. And that takes research to respond to. And I'm not going to be able to do it necessarily on the spot. I have a lot of knowledge about all the topics, but I don't know for sure that they're not just going to pull something out of the left field that I'm not familiar with, that I won't be able to respond to, because that's sort of a big way that they argue, is sort of info dumping. It's called the Gish Gallop in debating. The Gish Gallop is where you present, rapidly a bunch of points in a row, and you don't give the opponent time to respond to each substantively. And every time that they respond to one, you respond with another 10. And then they look like they've been swamped with arguments, when if they could scrupulously go through one by one through each of the arguments, they could debunk all of them. But it doesn't matter, because they have the appearance as if they have swamped you with arguments that you can't respond to. And I think that's something I see a lot from authoritarian leftists. But yeah, I think that it has to be done in the right context. And insofar as it comes to like the Jubilee thing, I'd probably say yes, because that's such a big platform and it has so many different kinds of people listening to it that I think I could probably persuade quite a few people there, even if I had a bunch of bad faith opponents. But that'll never happen. My channel just isn't big enough. They don't care about me. I can't get them channel views. Lel Dornix says, hey, random question about the After the Revolution video. Are the separate friendly amendments proposed in the deal breaker / non-deal breaker section supposed to fully replace the proposal? No, they amend the proposal. You know, you wouldn't, it wouldn't be an amendment if you're fully replacing the proposal. That would just be a different proposal, in which case those proposals would have to compete for implementation. However, you would hope to see, competing proposals made commensurate through friendly amendment. That's what you would hope to see. But there, of course, will be times when that's just not going to work out. Edgar says, what about economics? That seems more physical than politics. I mean, I certainly see an argument for that, but I think that economics is still deeply, deeply mediated by sociology. Because what we see is that you can reconfigure economic systems within a society, but if the sociology is just not fit for it, then there's going to be a degeneration into a previous state, thus the importance of prefiguration. And what that means is that people's beliefs, ideas, expectations, and so on are going to either enable or disable certain economic paradigms from being enacted, number one. But, you know, I think that there are aspects of economics that you could model in an objective sense, but I think that even distribution has enormous chaotic variables that are very, very difficult to model. I'm not saying that I think it's impossible. I think that you probably could mathematically model a more just economic distribution system, but I don't think that it is so distinct from sociology that it doesn't fall victim to the same problems that were described about sociology. I think that, as Nikolai says, economics is deeply political. Knowledge and Defense asks, by Rojava's increased centralization, are you referring to their executive council, the Syrian Democratic Council, or the PYD kicking out usually right parties that are against bottom-up orgs? I wouldn't really object to the latter of the two. I'm talking about the fact that it seems like, as of their last constitution, we are seeing less power in the local councils. Local councils have given more power to the state apparatus, and that the military command seems to be taking more of an executive position over the polity itself. It's not to say that it has completely established an executive relation, but it is becoming more concentrated. The power is becoming more concentrated in these sorts of bodies. Nikolai says, you see, Anark, this is why it's better to respond in long form, as all philosophical debates have gone. Today, that means videos, but it could also mean articles. No info dumps needed. Oh, hi, Murray. You're silly. What are you doing? What are you doing? Oh, baby. You want attentions? Want attentions? Here, I'm going to show you to the stream. You ready? Oh, you going to lay down? Okay, you can lay down. No, he's just going to lay down. He's going to hang out here. Yeah, Anarcho Pill says, economists put together a lot of nonsense and lies in the name of science to demonstrate that the capitalists have the right to live off the work of others. Yeah, I mean, it's an example of how economics can be distorted by sociological and political concerns. Aston Martin says, is there any worth in directly actioning gas stations? They are the front line of really big players regarding climate change. Seems like one of the few interjunctions between society. I would say no. No, I don't think that's going to work at all. Number one, that's not the bottleneck. The bottleneck is in production. The bottleneck is not in distribution. And furthermore, that's not the solution. I mean, it just wouldn't fix the problem. The problem is that we have an entire society structured around fossil fuels, like the fact we have the cars, the fact we have the roads, the fact that we have the oil derricks. The entire interplaying structure is what causes the issue. The gas stations themselves, they're just distributing something that's a foregone conclusion or bygone conclusion. The gas stations are, not meaningful. It's not meaningful to do anything to a gas station. Furthermore, all you're going to do is piss off the people around you. It's not actually going to stop the industry, number one. And number two, you're just going to piss off all the people who need gas. Because at the end of the day, people still have to drive their cars to get to work. People still have to work. Buses still have to run. Trucks still have to transport things from place to place. That I would not say is a very good target at all. No. Ingrained says, direct action against oil executives and their factories. Yeah, I'm not going to say that's what you should do, but no, I don't have the same critique as last time. I mean, those are bottlenecks. Those are more the bottlenecks for sure. It's like you need to think much bigger scale. I think one of the failures of the mechanisms of direct action that we've been seeing for the last few decades is that they're way too small potatoes. They're just aiming at things that aren't bottlenecks. They're aiming at things that are results of much larger systems. Yeah, as RJ Kilroy says, and now I must remind you all not to discuss illegal shit here. Yeah. I would be careful of anything you want to say on this subject. I got a donation from Sabiondo162 for $2. They say, opinion on more focus on local issues versus global. I mean, I get it. I get the idea, but ultimately, unfortunately, we kind of have to be focused on all of it. I would say acting locally is very important, because that's where you can have a bigger impact. Cooperation Tulsa is trying to develop food sovereignty for the area. We're not in the mindset that, this is going to be food sovereignty for the whole planet, because we can't create food sovereignty for the whole planet with the power that we have. That comes at a later date, if at all, within our future. So by necessity, our praxis is almost always going to be focused locally, but there is importance in solidarity actions, and those can absolutely build connections between international actors. But I will say that we have much less power over changing international conditions. So I would say that local focus for praxis is good. Dual power should pretty much always be locally focused, because there's no other option really. But we should also be very aware of global affairs and our relation to other people that are being oppressed all over the planet. I think it's a very important aspect. So unfortunately, even though it would be nice to be able to focus on one or the other, we kind of have to always focus on both. Aston Martin says, explain bottlenecks. Bottlenecks are places where a single juncture, a lot goes through a single juncture. Okay. So these are places where disruption, it will cause large run-on effects to other things in the chain. You're looking for places where power is too centralized, distribution has to go through a single route. You're looking for places where the system is very reliant on a single link, and that single link has impact on many other parts of the system. You never want to focus on a place where that thing has relatively many copies, right? Like, for example, one of the reasons why strikes were so powerful, especially strikes of dock workers, is that if you can get dock workers to strike, that's a bottleneck, right? That's a bottleneck because everything coming into the port has to go through the port and has to go through the dock workers. So get the dock workers to strike and boom, that bottlenecks the entire economy right there. But if, for example, we had just gotten individual truckers to strike, or if we gotten individual workers at a Walmart to strike, notice that those are way less of a bottleneck, right? Like, get one trucker to strike, another trucker will take his place. There's thousands, tens of thousands of trucks, distributing things every single day all over the United States. One trucker not doing his job doesn't change the whole thing. But one union of dock workers on one dock can change an enormous amount about the distribution on an entire continent. Likewise, this is why railway strikes have been so powerful historically. Railways are another one of those bottlenecks. So always focus on bottlenecks. Never focus on things where there is extremely diffuse distribution, or things that come at the end of a long process of distribution. Like that. That's why it's kind of silly when people are like, people on the internet are always talking about firebombing Walmart, but never firebomb a Walmart. That wouldn't even be effective if they did. Like, it'd just be destructive. It really wouldn't do a whole lot. Like, where all of that comes from is the bottleneck. The store comes at the end of the process of distribution. So all the power kind of remains. If you burn down a Walmart, they can just rebuild the Walmart. All the logistics and the supply chains remain. So it's not a bottleneck. Like that. I hope that makes sense. Ingrained in grain. Thoughts on the PKK dissolving? It's kind of hard to say what's actually going to happen. I've responded to this on the last 2 live streams. It's not clear what's actually going to happen. They say they're disarming, but part of me thinks that this is just all part of a big deal to get Echelon released. So we'll find out. We'll find out what actually happens. I would say wait and watch on that one. Rotten Mouse says, "Hey, Anark. While ago, I asked your thoughts on the compatibility of anarchism and leftcom. Read up more on leftcoms and the movement in Germany. You think they were mistaken not to do a united front, as Trotsky suggested? I think that there should always be a united front among libertarian socialists, but libertarian socialists should never unite with authoritarian leftists, other than sometimes tactically, but never strategically, and certainly never, ever organizationally. It's very dangerous to ally with authoritarian leftists. They absolutely will try to take over your shit 100% of the time." Miles Norsworthy nailed it. You have to target the rate limiting step. That's exactly right. Anarcho-Pill says, "Do you think Trump's tariffs are accidental communist praxis? He's bottlenecking the economy hard." I mean, I've jokingly said that it's almost unironically anti-imperialist praxis because he's destroying the American economy, and he is forcing all of America's national opponents to not rely on the United States for distribution. Not rely on the United States both as a buyer economy and as an economy that sells things. because the United States is volatile. And in business, you don't focus, you generally try to stay away from highly volatile assets unless you can afford the risk. And so the United States is just becoming more and more volatile. And that means that we're going to see less investment. That means that we're going to see less international cooperation. And that really damages the United States position as hegemon. That's really, like, Trump is definitely damaging the United States hegemonic position. And it's funny because I don't think that's necessarily his intention, but he has the hubris of hierarchy, right? So we'll find out what happens. But I mean, he's fucking it up. It's possible he could have used tariffs as a useful mechanism, a useful economic mechanism, but he's miserably failed to do so. He nearly started a global trade war, and he has permanently damaged economic relations with China. And much as he might think that that's going to be okay and just turn out fine, it would not turn out fine. He narrowly avoided the shelves being bare in our grocery stores for a few, like, almost indefinitely. You know, we were getting empty cargo ships coming in from the tariffs destroying purchasing. And that will destroy the American economy, and it will never recover if that were to go on for too long. If Trump were to put in place those tariffs, and then a buying were to plummet, and that were to be sustained for an extended period of time, months or years, that would cause probably a global depression, because that would lead to the collapse of a bunch of sectors of the American economy. The American economy is essentially one of if you are an investor and you are either investing domestically or from abroad, the American economy is supposed to be a way that you make money, because the American economy is supposed to be continually undergoing growth. So we have a ton of foreign investment. We have a ton of domestic investment. But if he were to fuck up huge sectors of the economy, that would lead to us having a dwindling GDP. It would make us a worse target for investment, both domestically and abroad. Domestically, especially because we would bankrupt a bunch of rich people who would otherwise be investing in the stock market. And that would lead to an economic collapse, probably not just of the United States, but of the planet. And that would ultimately not benefit the United States as the global hegemon. That would ultimately harm the United States as the global hegemon. And I think the only reason why Trump ever did or is doing and has been doing what he's doing is Trump is using shock doctrine on the American people. Shock doctrine, like, what do? You go in and you essentially economically and politically shock the country by fucking up their economy, fucking up their political situation, by injecting people into their parliament who are damaging figures, or figures who serve foreign interests and not your own. And when the economy is all screwed up and your parliament is all in disarray, then you coup the government. And I think Trump realizes that he has to put everything into disarray in order to successfully coup the government. He's already pretty well got his hands on the reins, but that, I think, is why he's doing it. He's trying to create destabilization so that he can argue for his dictatorial powers. It's that time says, if the U.S. didn't overthrow Salvador Allende, how would it have gone? That is impossible to know. I think that it probably would have given us the best example of a state socialist system, because it would have actually finally been based in some form of bottom-up formulation. But given what we saw, it looked like they were already trying to do too much. The state was already putting advisors into the workplaces to try to control production and distribution, and that was going against Stafford Beer's vision. So that was already before the coup. So I can only assume that that probably would have just taken place at a higher rate as time would have gone on, and we would have seen devolution into state capitalism, much as we would have seen in places like the USSR or Maoist China. Yeah, we would have seen, as somebody said, a cybernetic technocracy. That's probably what would have happened. It would have been state capitalism with cybernetics, which probably would have been a much more effective state capitalism. Anarko Pill says, Yugoslavia thus far has been the best example, but speaking of bottlenecks, having a dictator is a massive bottleneck. Yeah, it's exactly what led to the failure of Yugoslavia. Or, I mean, you know, Tito had too much power. Everything was riding on him. Then he died and the whole thing fell apart. That's an example of a bottleneck. That's the reason why hierarchy is ultimately not anti-fragile, is because it can just be destroyed by destroying things higher and higher up in the hierarchy. You know, like, that's the issue. I'm not saying that that's ultimately just like the way you can destroy it, but you can certainly do prolific disruption of a hierarchical structure by just targeting figures higher and higher in the hierarchy. Now, most structures are built to have contingency, that is to say, to fill that position from somebody lower in the hierarchy. Almost every hierarchy has mechanisms for that. But them having to put a new person into that position is often so destabilizing that they can hardly function. And as we saw in the example of Yugoslavia, it led to complete destabilization of the nation. RJ Kilroy says, that's also why fascists always ultimately lose. That's exactly right, because hierarchy is ultimately always going to be destroyed by black swan events. And those can be either internal or external, but they will always destroy hierarchy. It is just not structurally capable of dealing with these problems that have just been stated. Knowledge and Defense says, is the Sudanese revolution not proof that even libertarian socialism needs vanguardism to not be co-opted, like what happened to the resistance committees? I am not familiar enough with the Sudanese revolution to say, but I'd be very interested if you can link me an essay or something which can summarize, what took place. Kitty. He's just laying up here by my keyboard. He had his little hand over his face. It was so cute. He's just a baby. He's just a little baby. Oh, I love you. Love your little baby. Oh, you're so cute. He is being so cute right now. I wish I could turn the camera for y'all to see him. Sabiondo says, is it okay to hook up with a Marxist-Leninist babe at a rally? Yeah. Ow! Okay, I guess Murray disagrees. He's bit the shit out of me. Okay, now I'm going to show you to the camera. It's too late now. You bit me. You bit me! Yeah! Oh. What are you doing? What is this? What is this? What a ridiculous cat. Now he's just back there sulking. Anarcho-Pill says, thoughts on anarchists and big tent orgs? I'm well aware that they have their limitations. I would say in general, I hold to the especifismo line here, but I think there are probably exceptions to that. As I've said before, I think it kind of matters on, is that the only org in town? Because if it is, I don't know what else you're really going to do. You'll probably find your people there. You know, you can find other anarchist, libertarian, socialists there. And then if things go wrong with your local, then you can finally form an anarchist or libertarian socialist group. Excuse me. But if there are other groups, then I would probably join a libertarian, socialist, or anarchist group if they're available. But if they're not, it's probably what you're just going to be stuck with. You just need to find your people. It's very important. Armand Prince says, are there any groups you know of that are filling a role of citizen protection or mutual aid that the BPP filled during the civil rights movement? Probably not at the scale of, but yeah, there are local organizations that fulfill both of those in many, many places. Here, for example, in town, we have We Protect Us, and that is an organization which focuses on community defense. And Food Not Bombs often does mutual aid, but the BPP was doing it at even larger scale than most Food Not Bombs. So nothing quite at that scale, but yeah, there are lots of organizations that separately are doing all of it, but not as many that are doing all of it at once, like the BPP. Why is specifismo not syndicalism? I think that specifismo has a better model for social organization. I think dual organizationalism is a better approach than just pure integration. I think pure integration it can have valuable effects, but I think that what it leads to when you do some form of syndicalism is that you end up joining the unions and trying to turn them into anarchist unions, and that historically has not been a super successful tactic. And that instead what you should do is you should have a specifically radical organization, a specifically anarchist organization outside of all of those that does insertion into the unions, not intending to turn them into anarchist unions, but instead encouraging them to adopt horizontality, to fight back against hierarchy, and so on. So I think social insertion is a better method. And I think syndicalism also tends to focus a little bit too much just on unions instead of having a diverse approach, which focuses on all kinds of bodies in the social movement. So that's my position. Got an donation from Kaimatara for $5. They say, I think if you want to abolish class, then changing the framework of controlling the means of production should instead be stewardship over the means of production. And then a follow-up, they say, the means of production is still the earth formed into a tool or factory. Owning as a class, ownership itself is a legal and social relation of exclusion and control. Yeah, I mean, I see that argument. I see that position. You know, I actually regard the means of production, like in my framework for power structures, I say there are kind of like 4 aspects of power structures, and that is individual conditioning, interpersonality, social structures, and environmental structures. And environmental structures is basically everything that's not humans and their conceptual structures. So that involves not only the means of production, but the nature. So I agree with you. They're essentially the same, principally, but I think that you're always in a position where you're having to kind of transition from old concepts to new concepts. And here, insofar as ownership over the means of production goes, when we talk about ownership, once it's been completely socialized, it loses a lot of the bourgeois concepts of ownership. Right? Because like the bourgeois concept of ownership is, you know, single ownership and ability to deprive others of use, as well as the right to destroy. But when we look at socialization of ownership, we pretty much lose those features. You know, no longer do we have the ability to deprive others because now everybody's involved in ownership. No longer do we have the right to destroy because now we have many more stakeholders in ownership. And then we're in a position where most of those, the nasty outcomes of a bourgeois ownership regime are diminished in socialization of ownership. But I do regard that still then we are looking at nature as a thing to be owned rather than an entity in and of itself that kind of deserves its own standards of treatment. And the Zapatistas actually agree. In fact, the Zapatistas have said that nobody owns the land, that there is no such thing as ownership of land in the Zapatista territories, which I think kind of goes towards the point that you're mentioning there. You know, it's like there's not even socialization of ownership. There's just not a concept of land ownership in the Zapatista territories. But I think that insofar as we have a conceptual bridge here, the socialization of ownership is a good direction to go. But ultimately, we want to see abolition of the concept of ownership over nature. So I would agree with that. Pepe Silva says, "Hi, Anark, are you a speciesist?" So it's funny because I can't imagine anybody is answering yes to that question. But nonetheless, I understand your intention is just to say, do I think that humans have some privileged place, that they deserve to be treated better than animals and so on? And I don't conceive myself as being a speciesist, but I also recognize that many people think that if I'm not a vegan, I am a speciesist, and I'm not a vegan. Or rather, that is to say that I do not participate in the meat boycott. And if you perceive that as being speciesist, then you can characterize me as speciesist. However, my criticism is one of practicality rather than ethics. I think that vegans are correct ethically. I think that many vegans just don't have a praxis that adds up to much. And that is because they've overly focused on the meat boycott and that I think that's kind of fundamentally a liberal way to deal with the problem. So I would say that if you're looking for a more viable vegan strategy, you're looking at something like the ALF. But I probably shouldn't go on too at length on that, given that they have jailed people for saying less. So take that as you will. And yeah, I'm open to the conversation. I have many friends who are vegans, and I agree with essentially all of their ethical arguments. I guess to go further, insofar as my belief about the role of other species is that every species essentially has a fundamental right to exist. It has an ecological purpose, that our goal should be maintaining a robust, a fecund ecosystem, that we do not deserve to be treated with higher, consideration than the species of the planet, that environmental destruction is abhorrent for a variety of reasons. And one of those variety of reasons is the way that it affects the many different living things on the planet, that it destroys unique niches and environments that can never be reproduced by planning or human intervention, that can only ever be produced by millions or billions of years of slow or gradual evolutionary processes, and that it is abhorrent, therefore, that we disregard the importance of nature, we disregard the needs of animals, not only as actors within an ecosystem, but as beings with an ability to feel pleasure and pain. And the idea that we are exacerbating the amount of misery of living things is abhorrent in and of itself. And I essentially just agree with all of those arguments. Sabiondo says, what were the political leanings of your parents, or did you have to deal with a MAGA uncle? Well, I'm 39, so, growing up there wouldn't have even been MAGA when I was growing up. Political leanings, my dad was a union man. He was in the Teamsters. He worked for UPS for the majority of his life. Pretty much my, first decades of my life, he was working for UPS. And he was generally kind of a, I don't know, lukewarm Democrat. And Mom has always been a sort of, compassion-based voter. She's always trying to think about what helps people. So I'd say Mom kind of is probably a liberal of some sort. Dad has become more conservative with age. Mom hasn't really changed much. She's just kind of maintained at that same position. And Dad has said some favorable things about Donald Trump, which led to big arguments. We haven't had that argument again since. I think both of us realized we just don't want to get involved in that. I don't really interact with my extended family very much. There are certainly some Trump supporters in there, but there's also some people in there who recognize that that is horrific, that Trump is a monster, that is the rise of fascism. So I'm certainly not a red diaper baby. I was not raised in a radical left household, but I was raised in a union household. And I think that did have an effect on my ideology, but also on the sorts of things that were considered standard in the household, which is the dignity of workers, and that workers, the needs of the workers were more important than the needs of a corporation. I am 39 years old, almost 40. Be 40 next year. Cyndia Mayer says, why do you think there's so much anti-science and anti-intellectualism? Well, not to harp on the same things that I keep mentioning when people bring up, like, where did it all go wrong? But I think that the vulgarization of postmodernism was a big part of it. And it's not even to say that the postmodernists themselves were anti-science, although sometimes they did say some things which seemed very anti-science. It's more to say that what people took away from postmodernism, what the masses, what the movement took away from postmodernism, was that everything is relative. There is no big T truth. Science is just one of many ways of thinking about things. And that's the anti-science part. And then insofar as we're talking about the right wing, anti-science has just been part of their platform for forever. They've always been anti-science. At least since I've been alive. Anti-intellectualism, that's something that the left has not usually engaged in, but I would say has begun to engage in recently, perhaps in the last 10 or 15 years. The right wing, of course, is virulently anti-intellectual and has always been virulently anti-intellectual for my entire lifetime. And I would say since always. But now anti-intellectualism is somewhat coming around on the left, and has been. We can see it, for example, in the people who are always saying that you don't need to read theory, that reading theory is unimportant, and not to, that we shouldn't encourage people to read theory, and that, some people just can't read theory, and like all the excuses. That's anti-intellectualism. The idea that people don't have this responsibility to improve their intellect, to become, more knowledgeable, that it's bad to become, to know too much about theory or to spend too much time reading theory. This is a form of anti-intellectualism. So, yeah, these sorts, I would say the postmodernism is probably more responsible for the anti-science portion on the left. The left has been having problems with the anti-science, I would say, probably since the 60s. Where in the 60s we saw a very notable fusion between the left and I guess you would say some forms of mysticism, conceptions of supernatural ontology. These became very common in the 60s and onwards, and they sort of stuck. We're talking about the hippies here, obviously, but that wasn't the only thing. We can see there were, strong inclinations towards mystical things ever since the Beat generation. So this goes relatively far back. But yeah, and then that kind of stuck around. Where essentially what you had was people who did not want to listen to the results of science on the left, who didn't want to regard science as being our best methodology for gaining knowledge. And instead, they wanted for a variety of alternatives to be equally good ways of deriving knowledge. I think that that's stuck, unfortunately. We still have not gotten out of it. I think that we still see a lot of it where people still try to pretend that science is just some equally valid way of knowing things. And they say that, of course, through a computer or they type it on a cell phone. It's unfortunate, but I actually don't know how to solve it. I really don't. I mean, it seems to me that, and this is, by the way, not to say that there's not some valid arguments against the scientific method. I mean, I've made at least one of those arguments earlier in the stream. It's also not to say, of course, that scientists always get it right and that pre-scientific mechanisms didn't get it right first. For example, we can see that indigenous people almost always have had a better conception of how the ecology works than science has. Science, insofar as its ecology as a discipline, has lagged severely behind indigenous knowledge for a long time and is only now very recently beginning to catch up and recognize that indigenous people had superior understanding of the ecology for thousands of years, right? But when it comes to questions of the hard facts of how the world works, we're not talking about, these sort of metascale, more chaotic systems. Science is pretty much unparalleled. There's really no other way of knowing has ever achieved the level of specificity, of detail that is seen in the hard sciences. There's just not even close to a parallel. It's like nothing's even 5% as close. I mean 5% in total. I don't mean it's 95% close. I mean, it's not even 5% of the totality of what science has discovered in the hard sciences. But yeah, no, that sort of nuance is not really welcome. I found a lot of the time on the left, and that doesn't really change my mind, but yeah, I think that it is a problem. I think that anti-science, anti-intellectualism has certainly made its way to the left, and that is damaging to the left, that the left should stake its claim on things that are true, and it should try to find its way to the truth as much as is conceivably possible. And the truth is found by correspondence to reality. We look and see, does this claim match reality to the degree we can observe it? That should be the standard for all acquisition of knowledge. And but unfortunately, I've found that it's not. People have a vibes-based politics. They have a vibes-based philosophy. I don't know how to fix that other than state my opinion by contrast. That's all I can really do. So I talked for too long, and there's been a bunch of comments in the meantime. Let's see here. Yeah. Anarcho-Pill says the postmodernists were just concerned with the influence of power and political institutions on scientific practice. Yeah, agreed. I think that's mostly just what it boils down to. I think that, Foucault, sometimes it seems as if maybe his epistemes can rise to something that's more of a critique than that, such that it's not clear he believes that the scientific paradigm is actually in any way better at gaining knowledge than the previous epistemes. But you've read more of him than I have, so I'll let you give feedback on that. Hypno Amber donated $5. Amber says, "Hi, new here, trying to branch out from Marx, formerly in my local communist org. Do you have recommendations on books to start on anarchist praxis?" On anarchist praxis, I don't know if necessarily I would say on anarchist praxis. I would say if you want, you could recommend my essay, Constructing the Revolution. But I would say that probably one of the best books to read right now about praxis is Full Spectrum Resistance by Anark May. I highly recommend it. I don't agree with everything it says, but if you took away 90% of what it said, you would be a far better organizer. You would have a far better praxis. But yeah, no, Constructing the Revolution is the piece that I've written, trying to kind of lay out an overview of an anarchist prefigurative praxis. Obviously, reading history is a good one. If you want to read about the Spanish Civil War, you could read The Anarchist Collectives by Sam Dolgoff. It's a good one. But yeah, no, I mean, that's as far as praxis goes. You could, if you just want theory, then you could watch my videos, A Modern Anarchism. They are also available as, the first 3 parts are compiled as an essay on the Anarchist Library. Hopefully those will be helpful to you. There's of course, other options, but nothing else is coming to mind at the moment. Knowledge and Defense says, what do you think are the chances of MAGA communism becoming the dominant Leninist movement in the West? I don't find that likely, to be honest. I don't think it's going to grow to a considerable degree. Hell's Bells, would you ever consider doing a debate with Hassan Piker? Probably. He seems like he's a good faith interlocutor. If you wanted to do a debate, I'd be happy to debate Hassan. And, I can think of things we probably disagree on. It seems like he has some disparaging views on anarchism, so we could discuss that. Jessica says, how large is the prevalence of anti-organizational anarchists within the movement? I've run into a few. A lot. I would say fewer than when I started. When I started, I think they were probably like 90%, somewhere around there. These days, it seems it's more like 75, 80%. So that is to say that social anarchism is definitely starting to become more prevalent, probably because the situation is becoming more serious. Our back is more against the wall. We have to take the situation more seriously. But unfortunately, I still think that anti-organizationalist anarchism is more popular than organizationalist anarchism. It is losing support slowly as it fails to do anything, but it is still very popular and is still pushed by all kinds of people who consider themselves anarchists and anarchist influencers and so on and so on. So, yeah. Max Kuhn says, hey, Anark, I just finished your The State is Counter-Revolutionary twice now. What books did you read for the USSR video? I want to learn, but I can't ever trust how biased books are. I think the one that comes to mind immediately is The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control. You should read that. The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control by Maurice Brinton. Maurice Brinton, Bolsheviks and Workers' Control. I think this one is very, very important. I highly recommend reading this. There we go. Boom, boom, boom. Put it here. But citations are in the footnotes. If you go to the Anarchist Library copy, the citations are all in the footnotes. So you can just go see what I used in there. I read numerous papers. I read some academic papers. I read, various things. So you can go find all those in the footnotes. Anarcho-Pill says, Bruno Latour has a great article on this called Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam? Where he says that the situation in the 1970s was so different from today, it was peak military industrial. Interesting. Owner Hep Guler says, why do people in the anarchist circles label Konkin and agorism as anti-capitalist while it's very apparently anarcho-capitalism plus a strategy to achieve it? I have no idea. Luckily, I've never met somebody who said that. On the internet, I've seen people try to say it, but yeah, no, I mean, to me, it's very clearly anarcho-capitalism. I have no idea how anybody reads about Konkin's views and thinks he's a leftist. He's not, as far as I can see, which means he's not an anarchist. Kirby says, do you think leftism can maintain its radicalism once it becomes more normalized? What happens when hierarchical structures become less and less harmful and people don't hate them as much? Yeah, no, I think that is a form of reaction that could take place in a post-revolutionary society. But I think that it's not going to take place for a few generations afterwards, at least. And you would hope to have very strong social structures in place. I'm not talking about interpersonal structures. Okay, we're not talking about just people's ideologies, but social structures. That is to say, charters and agreements between federations and all of that lay out the way that this horizontal structure functions, along with protections from reaction and backsliding. So then you'd mostly have a problem dealing with ideology and interpersonality. But we would hope to see this be constantly fought back against by the prevalence of horizontal norms in society. Sort of like how in today's society, all of the society moves towards the establishment of hierarchical norms. In a horizontal society, we would hope to see all of society move towards the perpetuation of horizontal norms. BTF says, why do you think so many rightists think that they're anti-establishment? The whole point of being a conservative is believing in hierarchy and authority. That's the most establishment shit ever. Because they associate the establishment with quote unquote wokeness. That is to say, progress on racial issues, progress on gender issues, visibility of minorities of various kinds, visibility of oppressed peoples, the alteration of traditional narratives to include people that are not just white cis het men and so on. They consider this as being the establishment perspective because these ideas finally made their way into the media, and we began to disassemble little by little some of the structural racism of the United States. And they in their mind thought, well, this is the establishment now. The establishment is these things. Instead of recognizing, of course, that these were minor trends within society that had not risen to the level of permanence or complete prevalence, they see these as being like secret, shadowy conspiracies by a cabal behind the scene. It's fascism always convinces itself that alterations of the dominant hegemony are deep, dark, shadowy conspiracies. They can't imagine that they would have come from the bottom up and that bottom up pressure has begun to change social norms. Instead, they conceive that these root from the prevailing power structures, from some, tiny group of badly intended radicals. So this is, of course, why we see the stereotype of a cultural Bolshevism in Nazi Germany, and why they've, of course, borrowed over the Nazi language here in the United States with cultural Marxism. This is just a continuation of the same fascist methods to gain control for a genocidal ethnostate. Oh, yeah, sorry, I'm having to catch up. I keep rambling for so long on each of these answers. Let's see here. Oh, I saw one and now it's gone. Oh, here we go. Hypno Amber says, in my Marxist socialist circles, I run into ableism as being worker-based, if that makes sense. As someone with permanent disability, I want to rep the non-working disabled community. Yeah, it's definitely a problem in Marxist circles. Marxist circles are inherently workerist, you might say. They're inherently based around the proletariat. They are generally very inflexible when it comes to this, and they don't really care about whatever other portion of society that is being discussed. They only care about the proletariat as the laboring masses. So yeah, they generally don't care about ableism at all. They don't care about disabled people at all. That is something you're mostly going to find among anarchists. Anarchists are the ones that seem to care about disabled people to any considerable degree. And in fact, you can see that all the way back to the CNT-FAI. When the CNT-FAI did their revolution in Spain, they actually found ways for disabled people to both live dignified lives, but also if disabled people were able and desired to labor, they created workshops essentially where disabled people not only were given accommodations to be able to do the labor that they pleased, but they also ran that workshop themselves. So they owned those means of production and they managed them themselves, and they instituted accommodations as they pleased. I found that to be very, very inspiring. So yeah, no, this is something you'll see that has been recognized by anarchists for some time. Because anarchists have never been just this sort of narrowly proletarian revolutionists. They have always considered the plight of, for example, the lumpen proletariat and the peasantry. And then, of course, that's also going to include those who are unable to work, which are often lumped in with the lumpen proletariat. But yeah, I think that if you're looking for that, you're going to have a hard time finding it in Marxism, but you might. There's libertarian Marxism. However, I think you'll be more likely to find it in anarchist literature. I couldn't necessarily point you to a good piece, but maybe some other people in chat can. Prod Arcsign says, one thing I'm struggling with is the word anarcho-communism. The ML screwed us over so bad, nobody will ever trust communism again. We really got to not use that word. Yeah, I mean, if that word doesn't work, don't use it. Straight up. Just like, I would recommend just using the terminology that communicates with the person you're speaking with. Like, that's just what you got to do. So don't call yourself an anarcho-communist if you think they're going to have a bad reaction to it. Just explain your viewpoints. I think that's one of the most useful things I can recommend. Just explain your viewpoints as they are. Don't give them fancy names. Don't use fancy terminology. Just say what you believe. I think that workers should be able to democratically control their workplaces, and the economy should be democratically controlled by everyone in society, that we should, socialize democratic decision making, and that decision making should come from the bottom up, and it should be directly democratic, and we shouldn't have representatives. We should use delegation. Just be specific about what it is you want. You'd be shocked to find how many people agree with you. Ubik, the lumpen proletariat is essentially the non-laboring masses. So it's people who don't have any ownership over the means of production, but are also not laborers. And so this includes criminals, the unemployed, various sorts of people who just don't fit into those other categories. Margot Sorn says, how does anarchism handle the problem of desirable and less desirable labor? I mean, there's going to be as many answers as people you ask, I suppose. I think one of the best models might be Paracon. If you want to look into participatory economics, Michael Albert calls this onerous labor, and his idea is that everybody would share it. Cursed Chaos says, do you think that neurotypical or neurodivergent people are easier to radicalize to anarchism? I think neurodivergent people are more likely to be radicals in a general sense. I think that neurodivergent people are often very driven by their moral systems, and they have an internally motivated moral system, and this can often drive them to radicalism. And I've said before that I think neurodivergent people are often kind of like the shock troopers of revolution. But revolution has to be able to communicate to more than neurodivergent people. So in other words, neurodivergent people have to learn to communicate to the masses of neurotypical people. Otherwise, you won't have a revolution. And so, yeah, I think that probably throughout history, before anybody even knew what autism or ADHD or any of that was, that you had autistic and ADHD people who were the shock troopers of revolution and radicalism within those places. Jessica S. says, what should take precedence right now for anarchists? Building rank and file unions or building community-based horizontal groups? Both. Both need to happen. And in fact, I would say that they go hand in hand. Build community-based horizontal groups and use those to do rank and file union organizing. I think that's a great way to go. Anarcho-Pill says, Malatesta said anarchism requires, quote, war on religions and all lies, even if they shelter under the cloak of science. Was he too optimistic about the potential for science to replace religion? I mean, in my perspective, no. But in practice, clearly, yes. Oh, my gosh. Oh, my God. Give me a sec. Murray being so cute. He just a baby. Sorry, I'm entranced giving him kitty pets. Oh, you sweet little baby. No bites, no bites. Sorry. Colton Roscoe says, sorry if this is a dumb question, but what are the major differences between between anarchism and communalism? I would say communalism was originally an offshoot of anarchism. In fact, he called it that in the first paper he ever wrote. He called it the democratic dimension of anarchism. However, over time, Bookchin became more and more bitter with where anarchism was as a movement and began to slowly separate himself from anarchism, drawing more and more distinctions between communalism and anarchism. One of these is that he supported majoritarianism as a decision-making system. However, historically, anarchists have supported majoritarianism in certain circumstances. Another is that at a certain point in his career, he advocated for participation in the lowest local elections. I also think that was a bad idea. That definitely separates him from anarchism. But those are really the main things. Oh, also the concept that if you wanted to leave a confederation, you had to get the approval of the other bodies. You couldn't just freely disassociate. Those are the only major differences. And it's a big part of why I don't call myself a communalist. I think consensus, if it can be done, is the best form of making decisions. I think that we should never participate in local elections. It's a waste of our time. And I think that free association is good and that we should encourage free association, and that we don't need for the Confederation to give their approval, that the process of disassociation is itself going to be punishment for them because they're not going to be interacting with a larger distribution network. So that's the reason why I wouldn't call myself a communalist. I don't really have any desire to associate myself with those principles, but those are, all things considered, relatively minor differences. Although I will say the participation in election part, that's more major. I would say that's the most major part, actually. The other two, I think they are within the realm of debate of anarchism. But yeah. Hey, Platform Radio, how you doing? Anarcho-Pill says, I think Bookchin got so fed up with individualists that he genuinely convinced himself out of anarchism. Yeah, that is pretty much exactly what I think happened. I think it's exactly right. I see Tixbug. I don't know who you're responding to with that. Maybe I missed somewhere where somebody was talking about SOCDEMs, but I haven't really mentioned SOCDEMs here. Jessica says, folks, question, how do I join the Anark Discord as a paying member? Well, if you're using Patreon or YouTube, you want to go into settings and give it your Discord information. But if you just also want to just like DM me somewhere, then I can just shoot you a link to the Discord. That'd probably be a little bit easier. Kaimatara says, isn't hierarchy a metaphysical belief, not a materialist one? That's why it takes so much effort to keep hierarchies in power. Likewise, deserving to be at the top of a hierarchy is a moralist view. No, I think hierarchies, I think that the difference between hierarchy and, a horizontal structure and a hierarchical structure is pretty much the deepest material political structure that exists. It is the structure by which human power is distributed throughout society. It is what the determining factor for how power is socialized, distributed, how power flows, what outcomes are. That's horizontal and hierarchical. Like that's what the concepts are about. So that is the most material basis for anything you could discuss. You could I don't include a moral or ethical analysis in my work because it's completely unnecessary. You can literally just do a systems analysis perspective and come to all of the political conclusions of anarchism. And if you just do a systemic analysis of hierarchical power, it just has all of the flaws that anarchists have pointed out. It's not metaphysical, which that word has come to be misused so much. Metaphysical is about the nature of reality, right? So like materialism is a metaphysical claim. That is one of many metaphysical claims is materialism. So people are really misusing this word metaphysics a lot. I don't actually even know what most people mean by it at this point. Maybe they think it means like supernatural or ideological. But materialism is a metaphysical worldview. So I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at here, but insofar as you're talking about materialism being about the real functioning of the material world, then no, power structural analysis is the most base material analysis that I can think of. It's literally things doing things. It's how do things do things. It's essentially what it is. And that includes everything. That includes their access to reservoirs of energy. That includes concepts of diversity and nodes, diversity of nodes and networks of nodes, the flows of power. Flows of power are flows of energy. Energy is the fundamental precept of physics. And I'm pretty sure physics is way more materialist than any political philosophy. So maybe I just don't understand what you're getting at here. You can clarify if you like. Okay, you're saying the belief that hierarchies ought to exist is metaphysical, but do you just mean ideological? So you just mean that, I mean, yeah, that's based on a philosophical precept. Right, which is just that every single power structure has what you might call justifying philosophies. Justifying philosophies may or may not be objectively true. They may or may not actually accord to reality. But, what was I going to say? So, just the justifying philosophies for hierarchical power are typically rooted in things which don't really accord to reality. But I think I understand what you're getting at now. You're saying their justifications are moralistic, not materialistic. So somebody was mentioning, why are so many ML groups TERFs? And I think it's because authoritarian leftism attracts people who are looking for solidity. They often have more conservative views that they don't want to inspect. And so they are drawn to something that looks like it has solidity, a demonstrated track record, and they view themselves as the practical utilitarians. And so they are often going to be persuaded by conservative social conceptions. It is going to be, this is actually something that's been found in studies about authoritarian psychology, is that they tend to want things that are established. They want things that are already well understood. They're looking for solidity and comfort. They don't like uncertainty. So when you start talking to them about how gender is a social construct, they just are tuning out, right? That to them has too much uncertainty. It's too much of a spectrum. They're looking for a binary. And that's not to say this is true for every authoritarian leftist. Of course, many authoritarian leftists are not TERFs. In fact, I would say the majority aren't. But insofar as why there's maybe a higher prevalence, I would say this is why. Anarcho-Pill, back to the science-religion question, says, on the science/religion topic, Malatesta even claimed that religion will vanish since science has now banished metaphysical phantasms once and for all. Too optimistic? Yeah, clearly too optimistic. Clearly too optimistic. I think that this was based on a belief that everybody was going to, that people were all rational actors. That everybody was not susceptible to brainwashing, to believing things out of repetition. And he probably also underestimated how religion was going to permeate into leftism so deeply, such that it is very difficult to even have discussions about religion or skepticism about religion in leftist spaces. It's instead these days about religious pluralism instead of, a more skeptical, scientific rationalist perspective. So that is not at all how things turned out. He was too optimistic about people's ability to see, to adopt the scientific rational basis of science. Knowledge and Defense says, what class do children and pensioners belong to? Also, have you ever heard about the Greenbelt movement, Kone, or the Indigenous Amazon G9 Horizontal Alliance? No, I haven't heard of any of those you mentioned there. If you want to shoot me stuff about it, I'd be interested to read about it. But I actually don't know what class do children and pensioners belong to. It's funny. I mean, it seems to me based on the categorizations, I know that it would be lumpen proletariat, but that's just funny because it just completely, really demonstrates the amorphous, nature of the lumpen proletariat as classification. Anarcho-Pill says, people who are invested in authoritarianism have a high need for cognitive closure. Precisely. Exactly. Platform Radio asks, are delegates in the Soviets similar to the concept of a dictator pre-Caesar? I guess it would depend on what era of Soviets you're talking about. But if you're talking about the early era, no. They're just delegates as an anarchist would describe them. That is to say, they're given the scope of a mandate, which can be edited by the people in the Soviets. They are just administrators that are given, that can be delegated or revoked at any point. As they moved onwards, they didn't really ever, maybe I don't know what you're referring to with the thing about Caesar here, but they really just turned into representatives like you would see in a republic. So I really just see them as like voting for a senator or a congressman here in the United States, except you did it in your workplace instead. Kaimatara, you keep criticizing Murray, but I bet you can't do what he did and grow books out of Chin/JK. Yeah, it's funny that I'm being perceived as criticizing Murray very much. I'm actually a huge fan of Book Chin, but definitely have some criticisms. Nikolai, I'm kind of blown away that anybody would claim lumpen proletariat has a clear definition. I don't think lumpen proletariat or petty bourgeois have a very clear definition. They were not even well developed by Marx and Engels. They were kind of like afterthoughts that just kind of came around by them realizing that there wasn't a pure bifurcation between the bourgeois and the proletariat. They didn't really develop them very deeply. So I don't see how there could be a claim that they have very clear definitions. If anything, they're the most problematized parts of Marxism, like traditional Marxism. They are very amorphous. They're very open. It's not even clear, for example, the degree to which service workers or people that like an Uber driver is petty bourgeois in the modern day, because it was so poorly defined. And that's why we still, of course, have so much debate of who goes in the lumpen proletariat, who goes in the petty bourgeois. I guess I should expect it, but I've never even heard a Marxist claim that those are well defined, because I don't see how one could even claim they are. Yeah, I mean, they are proletariat because we recognize that they don't have very much power. But if we use the Marxist definitions, it's not clear that they're proletariat. They own the means of production, literally. In fact, if you'll recall, the entire point of creating classification of petty bourgeois historically was because you have this era where you have the peasantry who are living out in the countrysides, and then you have some people who are living in the cities who they, you know, take, for example, you're like a blacksmith or a tailor or something, where you just own a little shop. You maybe don't even like actually employ anybody, but you own the tools of your labor, and you essentially do contract labor for individuals. These were considered sort of the perfect example of the petty bourgeois. But it's based on the fact that they own the means of production, and they essentially get to determine their income by way of selling their wares. And so they own their labor and they own the means of production, but they are not a large scale manufacturer. They're not, for example, the owner of a factory. They don't own, large scale capital, but they do own the means of production. And these were the category this is what the petite bourgeois was meant to describe. So insofar as that's the case, then it's not actually clear that an Uber driver is proletariat. We only instinctually respond that an Uber driver is proletariat because we recognize they just don't have a lot of power. And what we see in that is that there's a gradient about how much of the means of production one owns, right? So another group of people who are considered petite bourgeois when this was originally developed as a category were artists and artisans of various kinds, right? We already kind of mentioned artisans, but we're also talking about artists, people who just produce art. These people absolutely do own the means of production. Once again, they operate mostly on a contract basis. And that hasn't stopped, right? We have artists in the modern day, and they still own the means of production. They own their means of production. Often they even develop their own prints, and they sell those. And yet, I think we kind of recognize that most artists don't really fit into that category very well in the modern day. Back in the day, it used to be that if you were a very successful artist, you probably made a considerable amount of money because you're mostly selling to lords. But in a modern service economy, in an economy where we have, a bunch of people who can, in fact, afford the services that artists might offer, artists now have essentially the same relation to the means of production, yet we're less comfortable now calling them petite bourgeois. What I'm trying to point out here is just that these categories aren't clear. They are actually super vague. They were historically contingent. We can kind of point out what people we view as like, I don't know, their relation of power seems similar to the descriptions of petite bourgeois, proletariat, lumpenproletariat, bourgeois, etc. But in practice, we can see that the way that the definitions are laid out, which is to say, based on relation to means of production, have not weathered into modern times very well. We've actually got an enormous expansion of people who would technically be in the petite bourgeois, but have the same sort of power relation as any other wage laborer. And lumpenproletariat is also an increasingly kind of meaningless category. There's so many people that are disabled, and they would, in the previous conception of the lumpenproletariat, that's exactly where disabled people would go, is in the lumpenproletariat. Those who do not labor for a wage. It's essentially the old understanding. So Nikolai, these responses are not very substantive. Artists work for a living. They don't draw. What? The fuck are you talking about? Oh my God. Okay. you should take a step back, think about what I've said, because nothing you've said really makes any sense as a response. You just like spit out buzzwords about dialectical materialism. You always know that a Marxist doesn't know how to defend a point when they say dialectical materialism, because dialectical materialism is just this catch-all buzz phrase that Marxists say when they can't actually provide an explanation. They just kind of like have this vague vibe that a thing functions a certain way, and then they call that dialectical materialism. You'll notice that Marxists can never describe to you what their dialectical process was. They just say, and applying dialectical materialism, what I believe comes out the other side. And then they try to claim that it's a science, and it's barely even a philosophy, to be honest. It doesn't even, it's certainly not a methodology. It has no methodology to it. It's just vibes. Materialist dogmatism. It rejects mechanical materialist dogmatism. Of course, I should have realized. I apologize. Anark Pill says, honestly, the only thing that matters to me is whether you make a profit off of other people's labor or not. Yeah, I think that obviously there's a gradation in that sense, right? Like I as a YouTuber, you know, I own the means of production. Like I own the camera, I own the computer, I own the mic, etc. I don't employ anybody to edit my videos, but a lot of YouTubers do, right? A lot of YouTubers will hire contractors to edit their videos. And it seems to me that, yes, now they're entering into a sort of employee-employer relationship. That much seems to be true. But it's not clear to me that just upon doing so, they enter into a bourgeois or even petite bourgeois relationship. However, I think we all agree that kind of as it escalates, that they are becoming closer and closer to this bourgeois class relation that we're thinking of. But when we look at this, when we recognize that there's this sort of gradation, what we're really realizing is it's power structures. We're talking about power structures. Class is a metascale analysis, a sort of agglomerative analysis of how power structures function in society. So like what we're really looking at is what we're saying is the more that someone has a hierarchical relation to others, that this is developing more of a class relation in contrast to others. And the more power is absorbed into the hierarchical power structure, the more that that person is on the other side of a class war. So that's the real material analysis, in my opinion. You know, the class distinctions of bourgeois and proletariat and lumpenproletariat and petite bourgeois, I think that these are broadly useful, but they are summary descriptions of a much more complex power structural landscape. Anarcho-Pill says, but you don't own YouTube, which hosts your videos and provides the servers, connects advertisers to your videos. Yeah, that part's true for sure. Yeah, so it's like, but at the same time, the petite bourgeois, when that phrase was created, they didn't own the roads, and they probably didn't even own the shop that they worked in. They probably rented it from a lord that owned the property that the shop was on. And yet these were all parts of distribution for them. You know, they didn't own the shop where they bought their chisel from, and you know, the list would go on. But I agree with you that I think here it's a little more of a distinct aspect, that YouTube itself, the distribution platform, is a large part of the means of production that any YouTuber engages with. I think that's true. Agreed. Hypno Amber says, I wonder if in some ways you could call Uber, YouTube, online selling, etc. as techno-feudalism. See, this is actually closer to what I'm kind of getting at. And that is that really what we should be thinking about is the power structural relations. So when it's not just one's relation to the means of production, that's a big part of it. Don't get me wrong. That's an incredibly important piece of a power structural analysis. But feudal serfs owned the means of production. Okay. Feudal serfs owned their tools. They owned the plow, they owned the anvil that they did their blacksmithing on, and the forge and so on. They didn't own the land itself, but they owned those things. Okay. And yet we're not in this position where we're looking at a feudal serf and saying to ourselves, that's the bourgeois, right? And we're not even really saying that they're the petit bourgeois. They're in that fifth category of the peasant. And I guess what I'm getting at here is that it's not just that simple. It's about how much of the means of production do you own. That's what's really going on here. It's about scale of the means that you have access to. And once again, then here all we're really talking about is power structures. We're talking about the scale of hierarchical power, because remember, hierarchical power is about concentration. It's about deprivation of others from control of the total distribution of power. So when we talk about somebody having more control over the means of production, we're talking about somebody having more monopoly control over a larger piece of industry. So clearly, that's a more hierarchical power structure. They are monopolizing more. That's what hierarchy is. More monopolization over decision-making, over more of the total social flow of power. So really lurking beneath a class analysis is a power structural analysis, in my opinion. Knowledge and Defense says, are subscription services just feudalism 2.0? Yeah. So, I mean, kind of here's where we're heading, right? Where now we have to rent access to everything. So if you think about what the serf relation is, when it comes to the land, they essentially have a rentier relationship to the Lord. The Lord considers them part of the land, but they essentially get to use the land only insofar as they provide something back to the Lord. So there is a sort of rent being extracted from the serf. It may not have been obvious that that was the exact relation, but it is, right? For us, it's just more obvious that that extractive relationship is taking place. We are now more and more renting things from the hierarchical power structures. What they're saying is, this thing is worth a lot more, and you can't buy it outright now. You can't buy it outright. And so you have to rent it from us. That's the only way that you have access to this thing. And I think insofar as that we enter a pure rentier relationship where we own the means of production, but we're renting everything, we're getting closer to a neo-feudalist relation. We're sort of returning to serf relations. The only difference is that we are not a package deal as part of a lord's ownership, right? Like nobody owns us as part of the land. So that relation hasn't been reestablished exactly. But we see that this is highly rentier extractive economy is being reproduced, and it's being reproduced, I would say, for very similar reasons as to why feudalism existed. And that is, you had an enormous amount of concentration of wealth and power in the hands of very few people, and they therefore took monopoly control over a very large number of things. And now they only want to establish rentier relationships with the laborers who do everything. That's exactly the role of the CEO and the shareholder, the bourgeois, as you might say, to the masses. And today we're increasingly seeing the return of the rentier relationship, while simultaneously seeing a return of control over the means of production into the hands of regular impoverished people, right? And this is why I think we're seeing such a upsurge of a content creator economy here in the United States, why we're seeing so many people try to make a career off of TikTok, because they own their phone. Well, a lot of the time they are renting it, but they own the means of production. That means that they can use those means of production in order to make a living. But then notice here, even in the consistency continues, okay? Like this consistency is not incidental. It like continues because we're entering similar power structural relations. Notice that also this puts us into the gradated boundary of the petit bourgeois in its original intention. We've got artisans who own the means of production, and they are able to negotiate contracts on an individual basis to sell the products of their labors. And so here we see this extreme blurring of the boundaries between a massification of the petit bourgeois at the same time as the petit bourgeois is being merged with serfdom. And that is literally what the boundary looked like at the end of feudalism, where you had these people, these serfs who had some expertise, and they went to the cities and they provided these in work in shops, right? The same relations are playing out again. And this is why there's a strong argument that we are, in fact, entering another feudal era right now. Okay, so I rambled for probably, I don't know, I'm just going to estimate I rambled for like 10 or 20 minutes or something there. So let's go see the whole conversation that happened in the meantime. Euphrazina says, I'd argue that the product you make isn't your videos but our attention. That may be a very astute observation, because that's, of course, what YouTube's paying me for, right? Although I got to be honest, y'all, YouTube's not paying me much. I don't get much from the ads on here. I mostly get my money from Patreon. Once again, if you want to help contribute to the channel, I really need patrons more than I've needed them in a long time, because my patrons are starting to stagnate. And I understand, you know, we're on rough economic times, y'all, so I don't blame you, but, you know, definitely a little stressed about that personally. Let's see here. Tixbug says, even in a physical marketplace, you have to pay for the space you operate in. YouTube makes you pay for it by taking a percentage from ad revenue. Yeah, I don't think that's too far off. I mean, upon face value, I agree with that. I don't disagree. Makes sense. Knowledge and Defense says, so wasn't the landlord basically just a feudalist leftover? Is that why they're called landlord? Yeah, no, literally that's what's going on there. That's literally what's happening there. Yeah, Jesse Graff makes a good point, though. All they want is rent, though. And that is the main difference we see between what we have in feudalism. Okay, the serf was a package deal with a plot of land. They were basically a slave, but weirdly a slave with a lot of autonomy. So that is to say that if you were a serf on a plot of land, you really spent almost all your time just talking with other serfs. You probably would have rarely ever seen a lord. You rarely ever would have seen any of the lord's men. Maybe the person you would have seen most would be the tax collector. And the most you probably ever saw the lord or the lord's men was if you were engaged in corvée labor, which is to say the way you paid tax was by doing labor every year. So this is what happened in a lot of societies. The serfs would go tend the lord's farm for a few months out of the year. But that'd probably be the most you'd ever see the lord or the lord's men. You'd probably never see the lord when you did that either, but you might see the lord's men. But here we're not a package deal, right? The landlord doesn't own me by way of me living in the apartment, and I don't have to provide corvée labor to the landlord, right? So it's not a perfect parallel, I'll say that. However, when you think about company towns and you think about them trying to get people locked into company towns where people live on site and they only use like the script that works in the company stores, that's starting to look a lot more like serfdom. Tixbug says the dominant mode of production is still capitalism, wage labor and commodity production for the grand majority of the human population. Agreed. Well, yeah, I guess it depends on what country we're talking about. But yes, agreed. I do think that's the case. I wouldn't say we have left capitalism. We haven't. Really more what I'm pointing out is that even in different economic paradigms, you will see reproduction of similar power relations because of similar orientations of power structures that are involved. The total power structure, the rules and regulations those structures maintain and inhabit, and then the relation of normal people to all of those power structures will often reproduce relations which we might have thought were dead because we have entered a different economic paradigm. But even within that economic paradigm, here we are reproducing old power structural relations because we've entered into similar structural relations regardless of dominant modes of production. That's what I'm getting at here. Pillowwood says, is there a difference between power to and freedom to? In my mind, I conceive of power to as being essentially the ability to coordinate potential with actuality is one way I've put it. The idea that, so freedom to is almost like your degrees of freedom. It's the things you have access to, but not necessarily the things that you could bring into existence. But I do think there's a strong overlap here. I think that they are not precisely synonymous, but roughly synonymous, if that makes sense. So that is to say that when I talk about freedom to in my work, I'm mostly using it as a bridge into power theory. And in power theory, I'm using power as my basis. I'm rarely talking about freedom. So a lot of what happens in a modern anarchism is I'm using old terminology and I'm taking old terminology and I'm fitting it into a power structural analysis to hopefully give it a little more coherence and consistency. But when I think of when I think of freedom, I'm thinking of the scientific concept of degrees of freedom. So when I'm talking about power, though, I'm talking about the real capacity to actualize those degrees of freedom. KX, good to see you. I haven't seen you in a little while. KX says, I'm now doing a lot of legit work in my area. I've been staying over at the local homeless encampment most nights, giving out tons of stuff from the community, constantly defending them from the government. Hell yeah, that fucking rocks. I'm super glad to hear that you're engaged in that. That's really important. KX continues, and we are working on including and helping residents there organize themselves as well to prevent a charity dynamic. Any reading you know of that's good for this subject? No, I think this is something that people have to discover in the modern era. I think maybe the most that you would be able to find is like tenant organizing stuff. I bet you could learn a lot from literature about tenant organizing, but I haven't done tenant organizing, so I don't have any real personal firsthand experience. If anybody wants to link KX some stuff about tenant organizing, go ahead. Anarcho-Pill says, do you think all the rent seeking is due to the tendency for the rate of profit to fall? Was Marx correct on that? I don't know, honestly. I don't know. I just, personally, my intuition is just that rentier extraction is just way better than anything else for a hierarchical power structure. That's just, it's like, the only thing that's better than rentier extraction is probably slavery. You know, like, it's like, you basically don't have to do anything. You just get paid money for your legal entitlement, right? You're just getting paid money because you have a piece of paper in your hand. People just have to give you money because you have a piece of paper in your hand. Yeah, it's just kind of ridiculous. But But, you know, my intuition is just that why is it happening? Because they can. You know, like it's just so much better to not sell me a printer one time for $50, but to rent the printer to me for $25 every month. You know, you just make so much more money, and you already, and for what? For what? You're not doing anything. You're not doing anything. You're just making money out of fucking thin air. I already have the product. Why am I renting it from you? Well, the answer is simple, because it benefits them, right? I mean, you know, it's just a beneficial relation. And if you're in a hierarchy, you can extract whatever the fuck you want. But I'd be open to it rooting from an economic aspect, such as the tendency of profit to fall, or for the rate of profit to fall. Yeah. I mean, it's possible that that's what's taking place. Although then I would ask, well, then why did it take place in a feudal economy? And, you know, the reason I think it takes place in a feudal economy is just because it's just a beneficial relation for the powerful, you know? Making money out of thin air. Jesse Graff says, and then the church comes in and connects the lordship stuff. Yeah, wow. I mean, if we're looking for more parallels, excuse me. If we're looking for more parallels, we've got even more parallels with the resurgence of conservative religion at the same time, right? Knowledge and Defense says, are you aware of how slaves outside the Atlantic slave trade had more autonomy and that the U.S.'s version was uniquely cruel? Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, chattel slavery was not common throughout history. Like indentured servitude was the standard for slavery. Chattel slavery is intensely brutal. Even people during the time of the transatlantic slave trade were talking about how brutal the slavery in the United States was. Really terrible. Really, truly terrible. Oh, got a donation from Riley Alberta Strong for $10. I appreciate you. They say, in philosophical terms, what do you think the self is? I know you're interested in Buddhism as well as modern day neuroscience, so I'd imagine you'd have an interesting take. You know, I am uncommitted, you might say. And it's because I have so many differing pieces of information that I have absorbed. And I respect the Buddhist conception that there is no self at the center, that there is, you know, a void essentially, which is then of course layered on top with a bunch of aspects of the ego and the persona and so on. I'm open to this. I'm open to it. But I also wonder if this really conflicts with the science of genetics, right? Like, we know we're not blank slates. Humans aren't blank slates. That's just wrong. We know it for a fact. Genetics completely rule out the possibility that humans are blank slates. So then the concept that then there would be no accordant self is, I think, hard for me to believe. I think that if humans have certain tendencies that are genetically predisposed towards, that there is a self. But as a person who has experienced ego death, I of course recognize that one can certainly experience the sensation of there not being a self. As a fact, I've experienced it, and anybody who's experienced ego death can tell you the same. Okay? You can experience the death of the self. Given that it is a sensation our minds can experience, one has to ask whether that then it's like, okay, well then obviously what, am I bypassing a genetic predisposition? That seems hard to believe. then, it's almost like there's a layer, kind of as the Buddhists might say, there's a layer of void beneath everything that can be like accessed, you might say, right? And of course, they've probably experienced ego death through meditation, and that's where we're going to get their concept of there being no self, is that they went into such deep meditation, they experienced ego death. And so you can see why there's just, there's like a bunch of conflicting conceptions here in my mind. I certainly feel as if I have a good orientation to myself, even after having experienced ego death. It was temporary. Ego death went away, right? It's not as if I dwelled within it permanently, and I don't think anybody does. So then clearly there are intervening contingencies that maybe the self arises from all those mediating contingent factors of the mind. And that when we experience ego death, we're just turning off all of those contingent factors for a short period of time. It's possible. I accept that's possible. So I actually don't know. And I'm interested. I'm open to all kinds of answers to this question. So yeah, usually I have a way stronger answer to questions, but I actually find this one intriguing, and I don't know the answer. I don't even have a super strong opinion. You can hear that really what I have is a constellation of concepts and ideas and things that I know, and I don't quite know how they fit together. And I'm not sure if modern neuroscientists even know how they all fit together. So sorry, reading people's comments in the meantime here. I'll probably have to leave here in about 20 minutes. A 100-second video says, I hope you read this. I was a dim sock, not a sock dim, who switched to Marxist-Leninism after, as I felt its reformism was insufficient. I then switched to anarchism after reading the latter was insufficient. Bad Mouse and your channel introduced me to anarchist ideas. However, I do not feel like supporting you anymore as there are allegations of you being ableist. Yeah, well, there's going to be allegations of anybody whose channel gets big enough. I personally don't view myself as ableist, but yeah, you make that decision for yourself. Yami Tsukino. How you doing, Violet? Good to see you here. KX says, I can't stand the ableist accusations. Yeah, no, I shouldn't have argued so much with Twitter anarchists. I argued with them too much, and so they set out to find some way to character assassinate me, unfortunately. And apparently, it worked. This stream's been pretty good. I've been staying on topic for a while, but I'm starting to run out of energy. Eric Gray says, when did the accusations actually start, though? I don't even remember. I remember that, I mean, I've just had so many arguments with people, and it all just adds up. Like, the first time anybody accused me of being ableist is when I said, you know, people needed to have self-discipline, that they needed to practice emotional regulation, that flipping out on people wasn't okay, and that they needed to, practice more responsibility, essentially. And people said that was ableist because some people can't control their emotions, and that's ableist against ADHD people and autistic people who have rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And I was just like, okay, wow, very infantilizing, but okay. And then the next time was when I got triggered by a conversation about cluster B, and literally got triggered. I'm not saying metaphorically, I literally got triggered. Probably should not have even engaged in the conversation, because I just kind of said some sloppy stuff about cluster B, which I apologized for. But people never let me live that down. They never, the apology, they just ignored the apology, and they just kept calling me ableist afterwards. And then those people who would never forgive me afterwards, they were searching for every single thing I said. They were looking for a way it was ableist. Everything, anything and everything, they would call it ableist. And they just went on and on with it. Just continued saying it about everything and trying to farm screenshots to cherry pick to make me look bad. And then it just became constant on Twitter from there, basically just people saying that shit. And anytime my name gets brought up, people would talk shit. And yep, that's what happened. Twitter is a shithole. It's a terrible place, and it really encourages all the worst behavior. It encourages dunking. It encourages bad faith accusations. It encourages cherry picking screenshots and quote tweeting and dogpiling. And unfortunately, it also kind of encourages people to just kind of believe whatever they see in a quote tweet. Like, I remember this happening with other people in the community, where I would see people talking shit about an individual, and I would just kind of take for granted that that person sucked. Okay, I didn't do any inspection. I didn't really think it through for myself. I was just like, oh wow, people don't like this person. They must suck, right? And I just assumed it was true. And then it would be like 8 months later, and a person would come up, and I'd be like, oh yeah, I remember that person sucking or for some reason. And they'd be like, why? And I wouldn't even be able to fucking remember. I wouldn't even be able to remember why they sucked. I just trusted naively to other people that they sucked. And when I would go and I'd look it up, it'd be so minor, or they had exaggerated it enormously. And that's when I started to lose trust in the community's ability to discern who sucks and who doesn't. You know, I kind of slowly began to lose faith in the community's call outs, to the point to where it's like, at this point, I don't really even know to trust most call outs. Like, I need to see kind of a lot of evidence these days, because I've seen the way they've treated me. I've seen the way they've treated other people. The community has a really bad problem. It's very toxic. There's a lot of toxicity in our community. Yeah, as everybody's saying, like the average Twitter experience. You know, it's just disappointing, and it just makes everything worse. It really does. It makes all of our, arguments, all of our failed coalition building, it just exaggerates it, And honestly, I'll say this. That's not to say that I've never been at fault for anything that I've said on Twitter, because I've been out of line. I've been messy. I've had to apologize. I've wrote whole fucking apology threads and shit. Okay. But that's the thing, is I think Twitter really just brings out the worst in people. I mean, it brought out the worst in me. Like, people who watch this channel can probably tell that I'm a generally very sincere person. I'm not deceptive. I say what I mean. I try to be patient. I try to understand other people's perspectives. But for whatever reason on Twitter, the worst version of me was on Twitter, the version that wanted to dunk on people, the version that wanted to make people look stupid and prove a point. And, you know, the character limit, I think, is part of it. Because what happens with the character limit is what I want to say is 3 paragraphs long. But what I'm able to say is 1 tweet long. So what I have to do is I have to boil down a big argument into a really short space. And then all at once, it's going to sound rude. It's going to sound dismissive. I'm not going to be talking about contingency. I'm not going to be talking about caveats because there's not enough room to talk about caveats. There's not enough room for me to regard every little sub argument. I can only boil it down to the length of a tweet. And then now people on both sides, myself to them and them to me, are going to read things in an unnecessarily combative tone. Whereas if I'd said the same thing, but I said it in the tone that I'm saying it right now, there wouldn't have been an argument. But because it was very short, that makes it blunt. It makes it seem more abrasive, and it makes the arguments worse. And your alternative is writing tweet threads in response, which is exhausting and blows up into fucking week-long Twitter arguments and shit. So it sucks because there's a lot of radicals on Twitter, but I think a lot of radicals are beginning to move away from Twitter because of the Elon thing, but also just because it is such a fucking toxic experience, such a toxic place. And I think that's true of most of our social media at this point. It's very toxic. People are looking to weaponize small infractions and turn them into big infractions. And worse than that, even, because they've turned small infractions into big infractions, they also now feel justified in doing anything, right? It's like that old meme, like, my enemy is ontologically evil and whatever is done to them is justified, something like that. What's the meme? Let me find it. My enemy is ontologically evil. Oh, yeah, I mean, it's like, where is it? Oh, yeah. There we go. How I wake up knowing my enemies are ontologically evil and there's no act against them, which is wrong, right? It's like, that's the way people start acting as soon as they've made an enemy on Twitter. Like, they just get like fucking brain broken about it. Like they become obsessed, and it's like genuinely terrifying. I've had people threaten to kill me. I've had people tell me that they wished people close to me died from sicknesses. I've had people try to release revenge porn of me. I've had people try to dox me. I've had people try to like find out where I live. I've had people try to have groups disassociate from me. They would send them emails and cherry pick screenshots and shit. Like, Twitter is genuinely not a safe place. It's not a safe place for radicals. It is a damage. It damages our coalitions. It damages solidarity. And it really brings out the worst in everybody. That's my experience. Brandon says, you think it was psyops or something, or just failed praxis? No, I don't think it was. I mean, maybe a few of them. I'm not saying none of them, maybe some, but when people, the sad truth is you don't need to be paid to be doing the job of a Fed, basically, right? Like that's the truth. Nobody needs to pay you for you to break up coalitions and be a wrecker and be toxic and be selfish and be deceptive and manipulative. Nobody needs to pay you for that. Sadly, that's just, people do that for free, apparently. I think that there's like, on Twitter, what I think happens a lot is that you have one group, which these are bad intended people. These people are manipulative. These people are deceitful. These people do develop weird parasocial vendettas, and they are doing it to cause harm. But what you then, a much larger group, I think, are people who are well-intended, who actually have good hearts, who just want to be on the right side of the issue, who feel like they're willing to make hard decisions to distance themselves from people they consider problematic. And they don't look too deep into the details of everything. Or they have a very kind of shallow, knee-jerky response. And those people get weaponized by the people who have bad intent, the people who are manipulative, the people who are selfish, the people who are toxic and harmful. And there's not really much going back from it, right? Like once people have made the decision that you're the bad person, it's just done. It's over with, right? Nobody is allowed to apologize or backtrack. Nobody is allowed to just have flaws. Also, nobody will ever just accept that they were deceived, that there was cherry pick screenshots or misrepresentation of somebody's position. Nobody will ever kind of like double back on that, I've noticed. So it leads to a deeply punitive culture. And it's very unhealthy. It was bad for my mental health. I have to imagine it's bad for everybody else's mental health who's engaged in it. Of all social media, probably the most damaging of all of them, if I had to say. And that's impressive. KX says, that's all well and cool, but you actually lost the debate because you used Twitter. Sorry. Yeah, well, I certainly should have stopped using Twitter. These days I just retweet. Maybe I'll talk shit to right-wingers, but... Yeah, as SPVRK says, it's never okay to admit you're wrong on Twitter. That's exactly right. They all want you to apologize, but when you apologize, they don't care. They always just find something wrong with your apology. So they don't really incentivize apologizing. Hell's bells, I've seen you ask this a few times, so can you speak about the proliferation of AI and what the implications are for our movements and for the planet? You know, the reason why I don't talk about it very much is because it seems almost impossible for me to know what is going to happen. It's a developing technology. So the way its current incarnation is deeply damaging, right? It's damaging in just a number of ways. I think the main way that AI is damaging is the ecological impact at the moment, right? Its ecological impact is too large for it to be justifiable. But that's contingent, right? Technology improves over time. AI will probably lessen its ecological impact at some point. There will probably come a time where AI will be highly decentralized. It will be able to be stored on a flash drive. You just watch. That will happen. Probably within our lifetimes. Probably within the next decade. Maybe even less than that. And by the way, I'm not talking about using the internet and conferencing with a server. I'm talking about literally they will miniaturize it to the degree it will probably be able to be processed on a phone processor. And so then, we've got different questions. Then we'll have a situation where, okay, well, no longer is the ecological impact the reason we're worried about it. Then, of course, we've got like all of the repercussions on artists, which obviously the way that AI is being currently used is just deeply, deeply damaging to all professional artists, and actually deeply damaging to people who aren't even directly artists, but are just like peripheral to it. People making movies, for example, most of them are artists, but even like the dude who's like the gaffer or whatever, it's going to suck money out of the labor force who is surrounding the arts. And then that is abhorrent, obviously. I'm also, and might I add, maybe this is kind of some boomer thinking. I'm not a boomer, I'm a millennial, but maybe this is boomer brained thinking, but I do feel a little afraid of what it's going to do to people's capacity to think for themselves. Because it's the first information technology that we've developed that literally will just like do the thinking for you, right? You could just like ask it to develop an opinion and then just take its fucking opinion. But historically, that has literally been said of every information technology. When books were introduced, people lamented that nobody was going to memorize anything anymore and people's recall would become terrible. When radios were introduced, people were terrified it was going to destroy the arts, that it was going to destroy the ability of musicians to make music, that people were just going to get stuck to the radio all day long. When the television was introduced, people were terrified that it was going to get people stuck to the television, and they called it the boob tube, and, they said it was going to make you stupid and all of this, right? There's a long history of this. When information technologies get introduced, everybody's terrified of what it will do to human intellectual capacity. But I do have to say, this is the first one where it is a little genuinely terrifying to ask what happens if machines begin doing the thinking for us, right? Not just storing info statically, but like thinking through things for us, thinking about topics. And then I'm also terrified of what happens if that power over AI remains in the hands of hierarchical power structures while we are at the same time transitioning into an era where it does the thinking for us. That's scary to me. And then I'm starting to feel like maybe Frank Herbert wasn't so far off with the Butlerian jihad. If you know Dune, you know what I'm talking about. But I don't know. That's what I mean when I say, I have to see how it develops. It's so contingent, I will say one thing, maybe this would be an unpopular thing to say, but it is absolutely not going away. 100% not going away. It is going to become more integrated into every part of our daily lives. Everything is going to get AIified. You just watch. And sometime, most of the time will probably be for the worst because corporations control it. But that's something we have to recognize. It just is going to proliferate because they want it to. Our displeasure makes no difference to whether it will proliferate. If it benefits hierarchical power structures for it to proliferate, it will. And if at some point it doesn't, it won't. That's essentially how it will work. And we have to prepare ourselves for that. I think that I understand that a lot of people are very upset about AI's role, and rightfully so, given the things I just said. But I also think that a lot of people are confusing their complaining about AI as a way to actually fight back against AI. If you want to fight back against AI, you're going to have to figure out like some smart ways, right? So like artists, for example, developed, what is it called? Poisoning. It's not called poisoning. It's called, sorry. There's this thing where what you can do is you can put something into your images where if the AI tries to use it in its training data, it fucks up the AI. Oh, it is called poisoning. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Like that's praxis, right? That's praxis. Nightshade. Yes. Nightshade poisoning. That's praxis, people. That's, you want to fight back against AI. That's how it's done. There's another one I saw where some guy made, it's like a honeypot for an AI where essentially what he has is a website that looks like it should be scraped. Okay, so the AI like scrapes through the website, but then it goes to one of these sub pages, and this sub page is built to trap the AI in an infinite loop such that the AI keeps thinking that it needs to scrape and it needs to scrape and it needs to scrape, and it just gets stuck there in a dead end loop for eternity, which is honestly, once again, praxis. But yeah, no, I mean, that's the thing is like, I am not a, I don't know what you'd call it, tech determinist or something, right? I'm not a tech optimist. I'm not a tech pessimist. I'm neutral. I think technology depends on the context that it's embedded within. Who does it serve? Who has power over it?
That's what matters. What is the social matrix surrounding the technology? So when I look at AI, I don't have any moral feelings about AI as a thing, as a process, a technological process. I have no compunctions about it. I have problems with how it is embedded in the social matrix, who it benefits, hierarchy. What's the outcomes? What are the externalities? Ecological devastation, right? These are the things I'm concerned about. If those things could be stripped out, I would probably have a different opinion, right? If it could be made such that it's disattached from hierarchical imperatives, I would probably change my opinion. If it could be made ecological, or at least just kind of like on par with the rest of our technologies, I would also have a different opinion. If we could develop a mechanism by which artists could prevent their work from being scraped and then turned into, fucking corporate slop, I would once again have a different opinion. I am just terrified of how it is currently embedded in the social matrix. That's what I'm scared of. I'm scared of it's a foot soldier in a war. And it's a really good foot soldier. And that's what scares me about it. KX says, that's the obviously correct opinion with rare exceptions to technologies, such as, for example, nukes, poison gas, etc. Yeah, it's funny. One time I actually said that and somebody goes, oh, I can think of a good use for a nuke. And I was like, really? And they're like, yeah. Like, what if an asteroid were coming towards the planet and, we could just nuke the asteroid before that, it would get close enough for it to do any damage to us. And I was like, yeah, okay, sure. All right. But poison gas, I don't know. That's a little more challenging, I guess. I can't think of a defensive purpose for poison gas. Got to be honest. Tixbug says the poisoning tools require you to have a powerful computer. If you're an artist drawing on your laptop, you won't really be able to use Nightshade. Damn, I didn't know that. I thought it was a lot more passive than that. Jesse Graff, you were saying where it keeps you from spreading the info to the rest of it. I'm biased. I guess I'm not following what you're saying. You said it destroys my source of capital, though. Are you an artist? Is that what you're saying? Riley Alberta Strong says, what do you think about Food Not Bombs? Is it effective praxis or just charity under a radical aesthetic? I think it's harm reduction. And, I think that it does in many occasions boil down to charity. I think especially the way that it's practiced a lot of the time. But I don't think that it's bad to engage in charity with vulnerable populations if they need it. The thing is that, okay, mutual aid is supposed to be a reciprocal process, right? It's supposed to be a process wherein you are connecting all the nodes together so that things can be distributed both ways. But the thing is that when you are helping a vulnerable population, it's often hard to find a way for them to be able to give back, I guess you might say, right? And it feels kind of wrong a lot of the time asking them to give back when they have basically nothing to give. I think sometimes you could probably ask for labor, but I guess the most that I've ever seen is that sometimes I've heard stories about people who are on the streets. They start helping with the servings, right? They go and they start giving out food to people. That's a good example, I suppose. I've also heard people be like, giving out flyers and stickers and stuff for the people who are being fed to spread around the city. I guess that's another good example. But it still feels weird asking for the reciprocal relation. Like, do something for me. I gave you food. Do something for me. The truth is that a mutual aid ethic in order for it to really be robust, it has to connect together so many different sources of power. The truth is that a truly reciprocal methodology would be us finding a place for them to live and then them being able to contribute back into the project. That would have like a cyclic effect. But all of this is not to say that Food Not Bombs is doing anything wrong, because once again, just think through this. It's easy to make the critique that what it is a charity, because I think that it, obviously it has a lot of those features we can see, people with giving to people without kind of thing. But also, can you really conceive of another way that you're going to feed homeless people that isn't that? Like, I promise you, people have been thinking about it. I've talked to a lot of people who've tried to think of ways, and it is just not clear what that looks like. You're talking about people who are at the very bottom of society, right? These are the people who have been left behind, and you're like, hey, what are you going to give me in return for me helping you out? I gave you food. What are you going to give me now? It's like, ugh, I don't know. Doesn't seem good. Unless it's a small ask, right? They have barely anything to give. So yeah, it's complex. It's the issue is complex. The methodology is harm reduction, right? Knowledge and Defense says, what if we use it to recruit homeless to join and help in direct action? Yeah, no, I mean, I suppose that could probably happen. It's kind of what I was getting at right there. But I've heard people try to do this, essentially, where they go and they try to develop, say, a houseless people's union, right? But so far I haven't heard anybody successfully develop one. I think that the best thing you could do if you were trying to organize houseless people is resisting camp sweeps. If you could organize among the people and among the people in those camps and prevent a sweep, that would be some of the best practice you could do for them. That would be enormous. The amount that is lost in those sweeps is horrific. Horrific. It's horrible. Absolutely gut-wrenching to learn how much of their things is destroyed in the process. So that seems big to me, preventing the sweeps. Or if you can't prevent the sweep, help them pick up and move it somewhere before the police destroy all their things. That seems like direct action to me. KX, I guess it was too long for you. That's funny. It's just awful to hear about what people lose in those sweeps. Truly, truly terrible. If I would love to hear about examples of people stopping the sweeps. Random Bird Boy says, what would you respond to people who ask, what about nuclear plants because of their centralized nature? Nuclear plants don't have to be centralized. Nuclear plant, we could make miniature reactors today if we wanted to. You need some sufficient scale, but you don't need the reason we do it at that scale is because that's just a very efficient scale. It doesn't have to be at that scale. We could miniaturize nuclear reactors now if we wanted to. Simon Van Leeuwen says, I think Dope Magazine actually found a nice way to develop a reciprocal relationship with homeless people. You should tell me about it. I don't know anything about it. You should send me a link or something. Nikolai says, this is not a political opinion. That sounds very dangerous. Yeah, no, it would be very dangerous. Super dangerous. You're basically going to be clashing with the police if you try to do that. I mean, yeah, it'd be very, very dangerous. But of course, I mean, George Floyd protests, literally people pushed the entire police force out of a police station. So, like, people have done dangerous stuff, you know? KX says, it's actually okay that some power sources are centralized. I know we're afraid of that word, but something being central isn't inherently bad either. Nuclear power plants in major cities seems cool. Yeah, I mean, it is a bigger failure point. That is one issue. I don't personally have a problem with, advanced nuclear power plants being built at sufficient scale. I don't see an issue because I've researched them and I know that they're very safe. Modern reactors are extremely safe. They literally can't melt down. It's not possible. You cannot, like, modern reactors can't melt down. And I mean that in a literal sense. Like, first of all, the most modern reactors have passive cooling. It's just not going to, it just can't happen. Like, the cooling doesn't even require it to be hooked up to the grid. It literally, the moment that it were to lose electrical power, it would begin cooling down immediately. It cannot. You said, what if you nuke a reactor? Honestly, even if you nuked a reactor, no, it wouldn't, because, like, the material probably is not going to, I mean, I guess it could add to the fissionable load, which would make the explosion a little bit bigger, but it's not going to melt down. You're just going to destroy it. It would just be annihilated in the process. E. Tusaral says, what's your take on the Venus Project? I see you talked with Arjang Jama and he's a big proponent of it. I think it's interesting. I think that sometimes it veers a little bit into utopianism, into making blueprints instead of praxis. So I would like to see more of the enacting part. I would like to see more of the doing part. But I think they're on the right track. I mean, it does seem like it's a form of, like, libertarian communism or something. And even though it's not calling itself that. Somebody kind of mentioned earlier that, like, Peter Joseph and Jacques Fresco essentially accidentally rediscovered anarcho-communism, but you didn't know that that's what it was called. That's pretty much what it is. Yeah, it's that. I think that, there might be a little more centralization in their original conceptions, but it's very much like a form of anarcho-communism. It's like a libertarian communism. Knowledge and Defense says, are you generally in favor of nuclear power? Yes. Yeah. After I got a physics degree, I'm in favor of nuclear power. After you, like, learn how it all works and, like, you really understand it, you'll understand that the dangers are enormously exaggerated. In fact, it's kind of the fear of nuclear power is currently kind of preventing us from getting off of fossil fuels. Because if we wanted to get off fossil fuels, we could get off fossil fuels not tomorrow, but in like a decade, if we just decided we were going to transition to nuclear power. But people are terrified of it. The anti-nuclear movement was huge and had an enormous impact on the left, but it also had an enormous impact on political culture. There are places that won't commission any nuclear reactors because of the anti-nuclear movement. And it's understandable because the first generation nuclear reactors were dangerous. Those were badly built. They did not have passive cooling mechanisms, or rather they had passive cooling mechanisms. They didn't have like anti-meltdown mechanisms. If they lost electricity, really bad things could happen. They were not disaster proof by any means. Modern reactors, the most modern reactors are very, very safe. And then we're in a position where we're just dealing with waste. And that's something that has to be considered, but people would be shocked to know how advanced that our waste disposal and waste recycling facilities are for nuclear waste. Nikolai says, Anark, is centralization irreconcilable with horizontalism? I think it depends on what is being centralized. Like, for example, when it comes to a nuclear power plant, I'm not like fundamentally against the centralization of nuclear power. But I would prefer to have it be decentralized and localized. And the reason is just because localization leads to more direct control for the people who inhabit some area. So that's the goal, is really to give more direct control to the inhabitants of any given area. And miniaturization, decentralization is helpful with that. But when it comes to something for which there's really not a whole lot of need to make alterations to something like a nuclear power plant. It basically just has a regime of functioning, and it just functions like that. So it's not like the people in a local area really need to make much of a decision over that. The only decision they need to be able to make is whether they consent to it or not, and that's it. They don't really need to have much input into the maintenance of the facility itself. So personally, I don't have an issue with the centralization of power or nuclear power. But once again, it would always be preferable to decentralize things and then to federate them into connected networks. Oh, okay. So I didn't comment on questions about solar energy. Solar energy is good. The issue with solar energy is just where the technology is currently at. It now produces more than it costs. That's good. So it yields, but it requires incredibly rare earth minerals. Like, it's not entirely clear that there is enough to do the scale that is needed. By current known quantities or current known reserves, we do not have enough to switch out the world energy to solar currently. But of course, we're always discovering new reserves, and if it became that important, of course, we would be looking for more reserves. But that's the problem. It's just really exotic materials. If we could find more average materials, then it would be great. The panels, they've done great. The panels, they've got it to where the panels are not as very like super exotic materials. It's the batteries. The batteries are made. Good batteries require very exotic materials, it appears. That's the issue. You know, that's the issue right now. So in my mind, if we can solve the battery issue and the yield on solar panels goes up, they're the ideal solution, you know? Like, the sun isn't going to stop giving us energy anytime soon. That's an ideal solution. But in the meantime, like, nuclear energy is just a very efficient way to get energy. It has very low risk. It's just expensive as hell to build. It requires so much investment, so much. But there's not political will for it. And honestly, even if there were political will, there's not popular will. People are just, they're not into it. You know? People don't want it. That's what it really boils down to. You know, like on the left, on the right, people were truly terrified by the meltdowns of Chernobyl and what is it, 7 Mile Island? Yeah. That changed the culture completely. But yeah, if we can get the battery problem solved, solar is the best. But as it is, we could not transition to a fully solar economy with current battery technology without devastating the earth through strip mining, probably. Somebody asked if there's a good place to learn more about nuclear energy. What is his name? Kyle Hill has a great channel. He is a science educator, and he has done numerous videos on nuclear energy, inspecting the science, visiting the facilities. You should go subscribe to Kyle Hill and then go through his backlog, and he has numerous videos about nuclear energy. Knowledge says, is current green not enough, even if a hypothetical anarcho-communist world cuts out all the wasted production? Yeah, no, it's a materials problem. It's been that for a little while now. It's been a materials problem. And that will be overcome, I assure you. Like, scientists are really damn good at that. You tell them that it's just a materials problem, they're like, I will find you the materials. Like it's a matter of time. There was a point when they were like, there's no way you can get the materials to do solar energy like you're saying. It's like, wrong, figured it out. And then now we're in the same situation with batteries. So give it time. In the meantime, I'm terrified of the scale of extraction required to get all of the lithium and other materials for our batteries. It's literally is driving imperialism. Which, once again, like, capitalist economies just drive imperialism, but specifically this aspect is driving imperialism to extract lithium. Nicholas says, what do you think of gravity batteries for solar? So, like, pumping water around. Everything that I've seen about it suggests that that's not very feasible. That it's just not a very good way of storing energy. It takes up a huge amount of room, and it just doesn't seem like it's efficient. I mean, I'd be happy to be wrong, but oh, yeah. Getting back to the question about centralization, the problem with centralization is political power. Centralization of political power is a problem. That's what I'm opposed to. I'm opposed to centralization of decision-making within the hands of a few people. The more centralization of decision-making, the more I'm opposed to it. RJ Kilroy was saying, so AI is scary and it's going to hinder our ability to think for ourselves and impoverish artists, but the situation isn't hopeless because the truth is on our side. That's my takeaway from earlier, I guess. No, I wasn't. I mean, I wasn't trying to even provide a narrative there. I was literally just giving a constellation of facts as I saw them. I don't know what the future holds. That's actually, how I began the conversation, just to say that I don't really know what the future holds and how it's all going to pan out. It's possible that AI will eventually be developed into something that is just, less damaging over time, but it's possible that it won't. I don't know what the future holds. KX. Maybe if instead of using water for gravity batteries, we could use everyone's moms on Xbox Live. Oh, damn. Roasted. Knowledge and Defense says, so if we reduce products to only the most efficient ones, is green enough or not? I guess that depends on if you consider nuclear energy green. Most people don't. If you mean solar, in order for us to transition to a fully solar economy, we would have to find many new reservoirs or new deposits of lithium. That's the current amount of lithium known is not enough to do the transition. But if they started looking, they could find it. Wind seems pretty good. If you combined solar and wind, that could probably get a lot done. In fact, when I went to OU has a really, really prolific material science program. And so there's a lot of research into solar panels and batteries. So that's kind of why I have a lot of knowledge on this. And I was actually talking with one of the guys whose work was on solar material science about solar panels. And I was like, should we do, can we do a full transition? Because it seems like what we should do. And he's like, basically what he said was, anybody who's an expert on the subject is going to tell you the same thing. And that is, we are going to need to diversify the sources based on the locality. So places that get a lot of sun year round, solar panels, places that are by the ocean, wave capture, places that have strong geothermal vents, geothermal energy. And then, weave it all together with like nuclear energy and just fucking stop using fossil fuels. He at least agreed with that. He's like, fossil fuels during the transition, we're going to need them as our backup because there's inconsistencies in the other forms of energy. But once we have essentially, if we could, we should essentially phase out all of the fossil fuel usage and turn it into nuclear power in the meantime. And then over time, if our material science gets better, maybe we could phase out nuclear power. But pretty much every expert is going to tell you the same thing, and that is that we should use a diversity of energy production based on local conditions, and that if we did that, we wouldn't need fossil fuels. Well, I need to jump off of here. I have to go do something here in about 45 minutes. So I'm going to jump off, get ready, and that is about it. This is a pretty good one. Sorry, I kind of ran out of energy here at the end, but we had some good conversations, good topics, not just a rehash of all the old stuff. Murray is already done with it. He's trying to get me to stop. And, okay, I get it. Okay. Anyway, thank you for joining, everybody. I appreciate y'all attending the stream and having so many good questions, and I'll see y'all next time.